Hello and welcome to the 200th episode of the Weekly Stuff Podcast with Jonathan Lack.
And Sean Chapman.
For the 200th time, we are here to talk about stuff.
Yes, we are. It has been a long journey, Jonathan.
It has. This week on the show, we're going to have two podcasts for you, just to celebrate. This is our Monday show, and it's our special 200th episode. We're not going to talk about any of the news or stuff or normal. The Twin Peaks, you guys will have already seen it. Who knows, maybe Cooper finally woke up. We don't know.
Yeah.
Well, we do know he didn't.
That's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. But we have not seen the episode yet, but we will talk about all of that on episode 201 on our normal Wednesday time slot. But this is our special 200th episode, Sean.
Yes, it is.
And for our main topic, we are going to be redoing the topic from our very first episode, which was our top 10 favorite movies of all time.
Yes, which we did basically 5 years ago in 2012 when we were both right fresh into college, basically.
Yes, so we have changed a lot. We want to celebrate that change. We want to think about that change. Let the passage of time show on our main topic today. But that's not all we have for you.
No, not quite.
We have some fun things to announce.
Yes, we've been hard at work behind the scenes.
We
Jonathan.
have been. And that is because we are launching some new things. We have, I think, for a while wanted to do more than just the one weekly podcast.
Yeah.
And that's not changing. It'll stay here. We've still got plenty to talk about.
We only ever have more to talk about, it seems.
It's very true. So that's not going anywhere. It's not changing, but we're adding some new stuff. And part of that is that we are launching a Patreon.
We are?
Yes.
What's Patreon, Jonathan?
It's a service that allows you to give us money.
That's a good thing.
Is that a kind of a crude way to put it?
It is the honest way to put it, maybe.
It is. No. Everyone's doing a Patreon these days.
Yeah.
And I, honestly, a few years ago, thought it was kind of tacky. I think it's kind of cool now.
Yeah.
And not just because we're launching one, but because I support a number of people on there. I think it's an interesting service, and I think it's a cool way to help build a community. And the number one thing we're doing it for is that as this podcast goes past 200 episodes and we want to add more stuff, it's just a simple fact that the more the more kind of financial support we have from this show, the more we can do in terms of giving you guys, our listeners, more cool stuff.
Yeah.
So, on a general level, when you donate to the Patreon, and I should say right now, we'll mention it a couple times, it's patreon.com/weeklystuffpodcast. We will have the links out there. If you go to Patreon and search for Weekly Stuff Podcast, you'll find it. Our logo is there. Our fancy new banner is there. You'll recognize it as us.
Yeah.
One of the things I say on the page is that, just on a simple level, if we have some more financial support, then we can do more for the main show, like buying video games and having equipment and the hosting costs and all those things. The more financial support we have, the more stable the show is, and that's just a simple fact of life.
Yeah.
But since we want to do more stuff, we also have some reward tiers. So you want to talk about that, Sean?
Yeah, let's go down those, Jonathan.
So we're going to have 3 reward tiers for the Patreon. And I should say the other thing is, we have had listeners donate to us in the past, and we have a couple who do some regular donations, and that's been helping me with the microphones and the upkeep of our hosting services and things like that. And I really love that you guys do that. But one of the reasons I wanted to do a Patreon for so long is to maybe give some more tangible rewards to those donations. And so hopefully we can move all that stuff over here. And so we have 3 reward tiers. One is a $5, one is a $10, and one is a $15. And of course you can donate any level, lower, higher, or whatever. But the $5 level is called the TARDIS level.
Yes.
For reasons maybe you can guess.
If you listen to this podcast, it should be familiar, the concept.
We like Doctor Who, and so the TARDIS level, $5 a month, we should say this is all per month donations, and at $5 a month, you will get early access to a series of bonus episodes we are going to be doing. We're going to start at least one monthly bonus episode, and that bonus, the main topic of that series we're going to be doing, and we might add more later, but this first one we're going to be doing is a classic Doctor Who rewatch.
Yes.
Which we have wanted to do forever. It's really hard to do as a main part of the podcast because there's too much of the moment stuff. Mm-hmm. So we're breaking it out, and once a month, Sean, who has seen every episode of Classic Doctor Who,
yes, I have,
is going to pick an episode for us. We're going to go watch the episode, and then we're going to come back and talk about it. They'll be shorter episodes, probably like less than an hour, but we will break down that serial, break down that story, talk about it with you, announce the one for next time so you all have time to make sure you can go out and see it. We'll tell you where you can find it on the internet in terms of like legal streaming and things like that. And it should be a really fun thing. And we will have sometime later this week or month kind of an episode 0 where we talk a little bit more about that project and give you the first episode to watch.
Yeah, and just to like sort of like give the pitch on it, so to people listening to this, at least for like this first block of episodes we're going to be doing, kind of the idea is to make it a good entry point into classic Doctor Who. So like it's designed for people that even if you have never seen Doctor Who at all and you're just curious about it, or if you've only watched modern Doctor Who and you are curious about classic Doctor Who, or if you love classic Doctor Who and just want to like hear us talk about it, it's kind of designed to be for all those people. So we're going to be starting and doing one episode kind of in each of the different eras of the show through each of the different Doctors. We're going to be starting with the first Doctor with the story, The Aztecs. So if you want to get started early on that, you can go ahead and start watching that one. But it is going to be like being able to provide context and give people a good sort of like overview of what classic Doctor Who was like, how it evolved over the course of the decades, basically, and make it so that I hopefully can be a more accessible thing for people, because as someone who has seen all of it, I know it is a very hard thing to go back and get into. And so I want to make it something that people can go back and enjoy, and hopefully enjoy listening to our conversations and kind of breaking it down.
And it should be fun because you have seen all of these. You will probably, at least at first, be picking episodes I haven't seen either.
Yeah.
So we'll have one kind of newbie, which is me, and one veteran, which is you, and we'll talk about this, and we'll tie it to the new series. And, you know, I think it's an exciting time in Doctor Who history.
Yeah.
Might as well dive into the real history, which is episodes from 53 years ago.
Yes. And we don't have to try to come up with some weird excuse the way we did if we were trying to just do it on our normal podcast episodes, which is how it used to work.
Yep. So if you donate at the TARDIS level, you will get these episodes a week before everyone else.
Yeah.
So you can brag about it to your friends. Then we have the Warthog level.
The Warthog level, Jonathan.
Which is the $10 level.
Why would we call it that?
Because we are launching on YouTube a Let's Play series.
A Let's Play series?
Yes.
Awesome.
And in this Let's Play series, we will be playing through games in full, giving commentary on them, and we are focusing on sort of classic games, at least at first, that we really love and we know really well, and we want to do kind of a deep dive into and break down. There are a million Let's Play videos and channels on the internet.
Yeah.
But I think what we're trying to do is a little different than what we've seen out there, which is more of kind of what we do on the podcast, which is a critical deep dive into the game, but while we're playing the game. It's almost like an audio commentary on a DVD or something.
Sure, yeah.
Although maybe with a little more goofiness here and there. And for our first one, we've already filmed 5 episodes, and it is Halo Combat Evolved, the original Halo, which we talk about incessantly on this show. And Sean is playing the game, and we're both talking over it. I've edited together 3 of these episodes already.
Yeah.
And we're going to have 5 in the first batch that are kind of going to go out to you guys, and they're really good. They're really fun. I think they're a different kind of thing than what we've done before, but I think if you like our podcast discussions, you will enjoy these as well.
Yeah.
And and if you do this at this is an early access level for this too, and it's not going to be as strict as like a 1-week thing, because in general, with each series we do, so the first series, as I said, is Halo, we're going to have like 2 a week up on the YouTube channel, and what you will get if you're a Patreon at this donation level is like a block of those episodes. So I think actually this Friday is when I'm planning to put the first block out, and that will be episodes 1 through 5. And there will be 10 episodes in this first series for Halo Combat Evolved. And you will get those first 5, and then later they will start going out twice a week on YouTube. But you will have those first 5 to kind of binge watch, almost like a Netflix kind of model.
Yeah.
So it should be really fun, and they are turning out very good. And in the future, we will be playing games like Super Mario 64, I can just tell you, is the second series.
Yep.
And we have lots of ideas for other ones, classic, new. Sean, you mentioned maybe one day we'll do some smaller episodes where we play things like Hitman and just have some fun in that, because you've unlocked everything, and we might as well go goof around in that. So
yes.
I think it'll be a cool series, and I think this is going to be a fun tier to donate at. And of course, if you do this, you get the $5 tier too. It all stacks.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I have already seen the first 2 episodes that you have finished editing, because obviously we recorded all 5 episodes together, but you went into the cave, edited them together, and I have to say the edits you've done are really awesome. I think like the little touches you've added are awesome and great, And so, yeah, I hope people enjoy those because they're a lot of fun to record.
And just, it does feel like we're getting to do something different than we've done before.
Yeah, we're getting to stretch our creative muscles a little bit.
Absolutely. So I'm loving that, the Warthog tier. And then for the third and final tier, for people who are rich or something, no, I'm kidding, is the Godzilla level.
Godzilla.
This is the $15 level. No, it does not mean we will crush you with a giant monster.
I mean, if that's what you want, I'd be willing to do that for $15 a month.
All right. No, but at this tier, it's going to be basically you get two things. We're going to do a monthly, or we'll figure out exactly how it'll work, but on Patreon, you can make posts. There's like a little blog, and I'm going to make a post at least at the start of every month. So we're coming up on August 1st, and I'll do that there, which is just going to be an open like forum thing and say, hey, what questions would you like us to answer on the show? What little topics would you like us to address? Maybe not something as big as like review all the Kingdom Hearts games. We can't do that easily.
No.
But you can suggest it and we'll take it under consideration.
Sure.
And we'll address it on the show. And at least once per month, we will look at that thread on the show and talk through and answer those questions and do a little listener Q&A. And if you're at this level, you get to contribute and have your question read on the podcast, and that'll be fun. We will also do a Patreon name shout out. Everyone likes doing this on Patreon. And once per month on the podcast, everyone who is in that tier has donated for that month. We will collect your guys' names and give you a little shout out and say some kind of random compliment or something.
Sure, or insult if that's what you want. Again, I am not above that for $15 a month.
No, send us a note. If you want us to insult you on the podcast, we can totally do that.
Yeah.
It is your choice. At that level, absolutely. So those are our three levels: TARDIS, Warthog, Godzilla. If you donate to one of the higher levels, you get everything below. You'll get access to the Patreon feed, where I think Sean and I will both probably just post random things sometimes too. And it'll be a lot of fun. And that also kind of tells you where we're going. We're going to have this Let's Play series that should be a semi-regular thing. We might have little breaks between the series as we kind of gear up for the next one. But, like I said, this Halo one is going to run at least 5 weeks because we got 10 episodes for that. Mario 64, I don't think will be as long a series, but we'll see. And we'll go from there. We have lots of fun ideas with that. And the Doctor Who thing, I think, that's something we have wanted to do for a really long time.
Yeah.
And within that, I should say, we do have a new YouTube channel.
Yes, we do.
The new YouTube channel is just Weekly Stuff Podcast. It's a new channel, so we don't have a custom domain name for it yet, the way we do with the Patreon. But you can just search Weekly Stuff Podcast on YouTube. You should find our channel. I have links to it everywhere. If you go to weeklystuffpodcast.com, there's a little YouTube logo at the top. You click on that, it'll take you right to our channel. I would love for you to subscribe to that, even if you don't want to watch our videos. If you give us a subscribe, 100 subscribers is the first mark I really want to hit, because if we get to that, then I can actually open up and do things like custom domain names and things like that, because YouTube has, you have to make YouTube enough money before they give you customer service. That's the model.
Sure.
Which is...
They're big enough now that they can do that, I guess.
Yes. So, and that YouTube channel is where we are going to have the Let's Plays. It's where we're going to host things for Patreons before they go out to the public, because we can unlist them and have them there for you guys in secret. And we will also have, I am resuming uploading the video versions of the podcast. Video not in that we're filming ourselves, maybe one day, but not right now. But they will be on there, because I know some people just like to listen to podcasts on YouTube. My brother does that, for instance, and it is a good platform for that. I'm in the process right now of uploading all the 2017 episodes, and every new episode will go up around the time it goes up into the podcast feed. But these do take a while because there are 200 episodes. So I'm focusing on this year's episodes right now. And anything that was on my old channel, which was my personal channel, that will get moved over to the new Weekly Stuff Podcast channel. So just make sure you go give that a subscribe. I think it'll be awesome. And a reminder about the new website, weeklystuffpodcast.com.
Yeah.
It's got all the information. It'll have a link to the Patreon too. Patreon.com/weeklystuffpodcast is where you can find us there. And one last thing about the Patreon.
Yes.
We do have a goal.
Yes, we do.
If we can get to $500 per month, which would only be 50 of our listeners doing like the $10 level, or 100 listeners doing the $5 level, or something like that, so every little bit counts. If we can get to $500, about 6 months ago on this show, I made a joke that the only way we would watch the Assassin's Creed movie from 2016 and review it is if we ever opened a Patreon and got a certain amount of donations.
Yeah.
We weren't necessarily thinking about doing it back then. It really was an offhand joke. Well, now we've opened a Patreon, and I feel like...
And now we trapped ourselves, didn't we? Well, you trapped us, more specifically.
I did. So that's the goal, is if we can get to $500 a month, we'll watch that movie that we are scared of, and we will talk about it on the show.
Yeah. We'll do a special Assassin's Creed episode.
Yes, with the Michael Fassbender assassin.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's all of the new stuff we are launching. I'm really excited about all of this, Sean.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's something we've been wanting to do for a very long time, is expand out sort of like the scope of the podcast, and getting money in would be like is the way that we need to be able to do that.
Yeah,
So,
and thank you in advance to anyone considering. It is an awesome, awesome thing that you would consider doing that, and we are very grateful, and we will work to make sure that you see that in the stuff we do.
yes.
And I think you will. So, Sean, before we move on to our topic for episode 200,
Okay.
I'm going to surprise you with something.
Okay, what's the surprise?
I did some podcast stats.
Oh, no.
Last time I did this was
God.
at, longtime listeners might remember at the end of season 2, which was in 2013, I tried to add up, like, how many hours did we podcast for? Mm-hmm. Well, now I've done it, Sean, for all of our first 199 episodes.
Good God, John.
Do you want to hear some of these stats?
No, but you're going to tell them to me anyway.
Oh, I am. From episodes 1 to 199, we have podcasted for a total of 29,427 minutes, which you might also know as 490.5 hours.
Oh, God.
If you break that down, there are 168 hours in a week.
Yes.
We've done this podcast for 490 hours. That means we have done 2.92 solid weeks of podcasting.
That's
also
a heck
known-
of a backlog, man.
Also known as 20.4 days.
Yeah.
Yep.
So this is basically just a month of our lives we spent sitting in chairs talking to each other,
Pretty much.
sending it out to the internet.
I also calculated the average episode length for every year of the show. It has gone up over time. That's
I
not
would
your
assume so,
imagination.
yeah.
Season 1 was just 2 hours. Season 2 was 134 minutes. Season 3, it went back down a slight bit, 130 minutes. Then we went back up. Season 4 jumped all the way to 2.5 hours, 150 minutes. Season 5 last year was 163 minutes. And this year so far, through the first half of 2017, believe it or not, this is the first year where we've broken 3 hours for the average, and it's 182 minutes.
Yeah.
And that's mostly because of the episodes where we had to cover both Persona 5 and Doctor Who, and were ridiculously long.
I think that's just like the effect of college education at some point.
Yes.
It's just eventually you learn to ramble about one subject endlessly.
Yes,
We have both acquired that skill.
we both have. The longest episode of the show was not this year's E3 episode.
Oh, that's
Believe
surprising.
it or not. That episode was 255 minutes.
That's a long time.
The longest episode was last year's E3 show, which was 263 minutes.
Okay.
Yes.
So the E3 episodes are the real ones.
Yep.
That's where it gets intense.
And that's why we're breaking those up next year.
Yeah.
God damn it. Because they have gotten... 263 minutes is just like 4.5 hours. That's too long for one show.
Yeah.
Of course, the longest thing we've ever put into the feed was the Persona 5 complete spoiler cast, where I put them all together and made a 10.5 hour episode. And that was dumb, but I like it.
You know, it serves a purpose. Maybe.
does.
I don't know.
So those are some podcast stats for you.
Yeah, that's frightening.
Here's to another 200, Sean.
Just to do another month of our lives.
I just saw the
Spit
light.
this way.
I just saw the light go out of your eyes.
What light? It was never there.
All
It was
right.
just your mind playing tricks on you.
So, Sean, do you want to go ahead and jump into our topic?
Let's jump into our topic, Jonathan.
We're
It's
gonna
been
talk
a
about-
long time coming.
Yes, top 10 favorite films Redux 2017 edition.
Yes, the real top 10 movies.
Let's talk about why we wanted to do this.
Okay.
For me personally, and then you might have different reasons. When I last did this list, it was 5 years ago, 2012, and 5 years might not sound like a lot, but that was about a semester or two into film school for me. Semester 2 into college, living on my own for the first time. Same thing with you, you know.
Yes.
And I think that list, I'm not embarrassed by that list or anything. I like all those movies still. But that is a me of 5 years ago, and I changed a lot in the last 5 years, which you guys, I think, have heard on the show as we've explored different interests and whatnot. And especially for me, 5 years ago, I had no degrees in film. In 2017, I have 2 degrees in film. Right. So I feel like my horizons have been expanded quite a lot, and I really... I so look at my old list, and I like those movies, but it would be so different now, and I wanted to revisit it, and I just thought, 5 years, every 5 years maybe, is a good time to do that list and just take stock of, what is your personal canon, and kind of share this with people and say, yeah, these are my top 10. There are a lot more movies I love, but this is something I can kind of show, this is kind of where my truest interests lie. And I really want
like this moment in time.
At this moment in time, and with all the transformation I've undergone. And I'll say for me, like, I did not set out necessarily this way, but my new list is completely different than my old one. It's 10 completely different films, one same director maybe, but like, yeah, it is a very different list. And it wasn't that I like automatically threw out everything from the old list. It just shook out that way. And I'm very proud of the new one. I think it's a cool list. But Sean, why did you find this interesting?
Yeah, like I basically feel the same way that you do, because it is 5 years ago. Like you said, like I have a degree in literature now. I speak a whole nother fucking language now, right? Like there's been a lot of change in my life and things I'm interested in. And one of the things I was really fascinated by in making my new list was seeing that in some ways, instead of my taste diversifying, my taste has specified over the years and narrowed into, I think, a much sharper focus. When I look at my old list, it's kind of all over the place and was representing me, again, at like the beginning of college, dipping my toes into all these different pools and kind of trying to navigate these waters and figure out, what am I interested in? Like what like really speaks to me like deep inside. And now my list does have 3 movies that were on my old list, though they're all in like very different places, and they're on my list now for most of them pretty different reasons. And I do think it's just something to, like you said, to take stock of every once in a while and kind of look at yourself again and sort of imagine and reconsider what are the movies right now to the Sean of 2017, or like the experiences I've gone through and the things I've learned. What are the movies that feel like they kind of define me in some ways and that I go to, that I care about the most? And the process of making the list, because I think that's something we also need to talk about. It's a really complicated thing, and in some ways I used a similar process as the old list, which was I wanted to make sure that I tried to represent at least like a good number of genres, and that helps you focus on not like, if I really wanted to, I could pretty easily make a top 10 list that was just like samurai movies or something that or like horror movies, the genres that I know a lot about. I could just do that. And I wanted to make sure there's like a good representation of different genres I'm interested in, but I did not necessarily be like, I can't have 2 movies of the same genre, because depending on how you define genre, like maybe kind of all my movies are of one genre. But then I also wanted to make sure not to over-represent any sort of individual director. So, like, the director, like, Kurosawa is another one that I could have easily justified putting, like, 3 Kurosawa movies on this list, and didn't want to do that. So, like focus down and narrow down to what is my favorite movie from this one director, and I'll have that represent him on the list.
I should say that. I did start with this list with one hard and fast rule, which was 1 film per director, because I have so many directors I'm interested in, and I wanted to represent as many of them as possible. So, if I were to like honestly list, like, there are some directors who, in a more exact top 10, I might have multiple films by, but I really did limit, and each one kind of stands in also for their au revoir in some cases. But I did have that hard and fast rule, which I broke on my old list, but on this list, 1 per director.
Yeah, so that's the same methodology I had, just because it is something where it's so hard to put together a list of that is only 10 movies, that you need to set some sort of guideline for you that makes it so that, because I think it does actually make the list better, and it makes it more representative when you can't just put the same thing over and over again, and you can't just put like, every single, like, all of your favorite Kurosawa movies, because in some ways you need to sort of pick what is the one of that director, or like your favorite Takeshi Kitano movie or whatever, that's like the one that represents this director's work to me, and put that in the list. And then the other sort of like methodology was really like, I don't know about how you went about this, Jonathan, but for me it was very much, I had like a document that just at some point had like 40 fucking movies on it or something, that I just like it was just kind of stream of consciousness. Every single movie that pops into my mind that's like a movie that I really like and I'm kind of considering, I put into a big document. And then it really came down to me looking at each like movie title and just like gauging how does looking at this movie title and like what does that like respond in with me, like how do I respond to this, and there's like a very specific sort of emotional passion, is I think the only word I can describe for it, that I have to associate with one of the movies, and that was like the thing that put it on the list. That was like not necessarily just technical merit, it's not just like that, it is this movie has to speak to something that I like really care about right now for whatever reason. And some of those were kind of hard to define why the movie is speaking to me, but it was very much for me a list built by gut check. because this is not like making a top 10 games of the year where there's like that's a much narrower category. This is top 10 movies of your entire life, and that's something that's incredibly difficult at some point to try to like justify how you put different movies on the list, and you have to just go by your gut, I think.
There was some gut check for me. I will say I was also, not to sound too hoity-toity about this,
right.
I was trying to kind of assemble a personal canon, like, different countries, different time periods, things like that, and try to put in 10 movies that I both have an immense love for and a personal connection to, but also that I think I could also, this, if I had to, I could use this as like my Sight and Sound list. If I were doing the Sight and Sound poll of like where they poll critics and say what are the 10 best movies. I might rearrange things a little bit if we were going by the strict criteria of best. But I was also kind of thinking in that zone of like 10 movies that I think define my artistic tastes, that I think are the most worth watching out of what I've seen, that I love the most is definitely part of it, but also I do think there was some of that canonicity thing of it to me. And because of that, like, my process was also, I had a list, but I would watch one movie and then go down a rabbit hole. And I have watched a ton of movies in the last 2 months while I was specifically preparing for this. So, one of my favorite directors that you'll hear about on here, I watched one of their movies and then I watched like 10 more because he directed a lot. And it was just, none of that actually changed which movie I was going to have of his on here. It was more like really getting a feeling for that and maybe helping me place that movie by also like where do I view that, the magnitude of this director's work or something. So I had a lot of that as I went along. And I had some late, I shouldn't say late discoveries, movies I'd already seen, but like maybe I had kind of forgot about when I was assembling an earlier draft, and then I'd look at it and be like, oh God, I almost left this off, and one of those is number 3 on my list. So you will see. It is definitely, I am pretty damn sure this is what I would like to say at this moment in time.
Yeah, me too. Like, it is something where, and one of the fun things about putting together the list was I actually was kind of surprised by the list when I was done with it.
Me too.
And that was a fun process of like that kind of like having to be like brutally honest with myself in some ways and being like, no, that's not the movie. Like, that movie might be better in some weird technical way that if I was like having like an argument about it, you could like with someone like which one of these is the better movie, I could maybe weirdly make a better argument in that format. But to me, like, no, it has to be the movie on this list. Yeah. And there were several movies like that, and I was sort of continuously surprised by my own list as I was making it and rewatching a bunch of movies like you did and sort of figuring out how to go about this thing, because it had been a long time since I put together a list that was like that sort of like far-reaching in scope.
Yep. So you want to really quickly revisit our list from 2012?
Yeah, let's talk about our old lists.
All
because
right.
I want to say when I was doing some writing, and you'll hear that when we get to the list, I was writing like sections for each of the movies on my new list. And as I was doing that, I was kind of listening in the background to our 2012 number 1 and number 2 episodes, because they're split into 2 parts, because I could not for the life of me remember what my old list was. I could kind of remember most of the movies vaguely, but no way could I have ever remembered the order except for what my number 1 was. And I don't know where that list was that I wrote in some Word document 5 years ago that's on 2 computers back or something. So I was listening to that old podcast with kind of like skimming through it, fingers in my ears going la 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 whenever we were talking about something that was like, this is really embarrassing to hear myself talking about this. I knew nothing about this subject back then. Oh my God, I sound like an idiot. And it was a fascinating process. It was incredibly embarrassing. And there's one movie, at least one movie on my old list that I had no recollection of being on that list at all.
Oh, I want to hear what that is.
Yeah.
Why don't you go first with these then?
Okay.
What were your 10?
Yeah, so my number 10 was Dracula, the Universal Studios Dracula, which I still stand by that. That's a great movie.
Good movie.
My number 9 was The Big Lebowski, that is the movie that earned that podcast its theme song, and thus earned this podcast its theme song.
Little Easter egg for all you old listeners.
Yes, another great movie. That is still my favorite comedy, and there is no straight comedy on my top 10 list this time around, because I kind of realized that's not really those are not the movies I'm interested in. I like comedy more for TV show stuff. Yeah. And so if I had to put a comedy, my number 1 comedy would still be The Big Lebowski, but I didn't feel like I had to force it. My number 8, this is the one I had no recollection of, and this must be because this must have been right around the time I watched this for the first time, and this is still an amazing movie. But my number 8 is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which is the one I picked for Best Western. And there will be an evolution of that topic somewhere later on my list this time around. And I would probably actually, if I had to pick, because in that podcast I was picking between The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly and The Searchers. Now I would probably pick The Searchers over The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, but there was another Western I would pick over both of them that we'll find out about later. But yeah, I had no recollection of that being on that. I wouldn't have even thought that I had seen The Good, and the Bad, and the Ugly in 2012, so I must have very recently watched it. My number 7 was The Godfather. It's also a very good movie, but it's not. I've watched that movie like one more time since then. Oh, that is another like small cat like criteria for myself. All these movies were movies that I had to on my new list were movies that I had to have felt compelled enough to see them at least twice. Most of them I've seen like 3, 4, maybe 5 times. So like movies like The Godfather that like I never was really I think is a great movie, but I've never been super compelled to go back to it. That's one of the reasons why it was pretty easily dismissed from my list this time around. Number 6 was The Seven Samurai. That's also a very good movie. Number 5 was Citizen Kane. Also a very good movie. Number 4 was 2001: A Space Odyssey. That is a very fucking good movie.
These are all good, yeah.
Yes, they're all good movies. I still think this is a very good list, my 10 list, even though it's a very different one now. Number 3 was Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, which is still the best Star Wars movie. Number 2 was King Kong.
It's a great movie.
Fucking amazing movie. And the number 1 is, of course, probably maybe the greatest movie ever made, The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, wherein a Cyclops and a dragon fight each other.
I've not seen that.
You still haven't seen it. It's been 5 fucking years, Jonathan. It's been 5 years, and you still haven't seen The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. Shame on you. There is a Cyclops, and there's a dragon, and they fight each other. Need I remind you?
My list, all right. Mine was so much more personal to me back then than like academic as I kind of think it is now.
But I have to say, when I was re-listening to those old podcasts, while I was kind of surprised by some of my list, I was utterly flabbergasted by your list because I didn't remember almost any of that being on your list.
Yeah. My number 10 was My Neighbor Totoro. It's a great movie.
Yes.
I love Miyazaki. Totoro is one of the best. 9 was the original Star Wars.
Yes.
I had a Harrison Ford block because 8 was Raiders of the Lost Ark and 7 was Blade Runner. Of those 3, Raiders is still my favorite, and Raiders would be Raiders is not on my new list, but would be in my second 10 because it's one of the greatest American movies of all time. Number 6 was Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. We're just going to go past that.
Yeah, right.
It's a great movie.
It's the best one of those movies.
But I don't know why I would have. Yeah. At the time, it was. I was Harry Potter. I love Harry Potter. You all know that. Anyway, I'm going to move past.
Yeah.
Number 5 was Battle Royale. Another very hard cut from my new list because I think that's one of the great contemporary Japanese films. But I just didn't quite make the cut, but I love that movie. 4 is Princess Mononoke.
Yeah.
And I'll just say, I love that movie to death. I think it's one of the best films of the 90s. I picked a different Miyazaki this time than either Mononoke or Totoro. I'll leave y'all in suspense.
Yeah, now I'm curious about what it's going to be.
Number 3 is The Godfather, which I would kind of say the same thing. Now, I have not seen The Godfather since 2012 for different reasons, and that's because... Yeah. That's a movie I watched with my dad a lot, and we did see that for the last time a couple months before he died. On the big screen, they did a cool presentation of the new restoration. Well, it was new back then. And one day I will go back to it. That's kind of a hard movie for me to revisit because of the connection to my dad. It's one of the best movies. I will say this. I think The Godfather is the best film to ever win Best Picture at the Oscars.
Okay, yeah.
And I think that's actually either that or Godfather 2.
Sure,
They are the 2 best.
Yeah.
And I will fight for that. But, yeah, not on the new list. 2, this is the other baffling one to me, is Back to the Future.
Yeah, when I heard that, I was so shocked. Because I was like, Back to the Future, it's a great movie. Like, it's absolutely a great fucking movie. I don't think we have talked about Back to the Future to each other since you did that podcast.
Look, it's a movie I really loved as a kid. I will still watch it sometimes now. It's a wonderful, fun film. It's not a film of particular substance, but I do love it.
It's incredibly enjoyable movie. But
all that said, I don't know how it arrived at number 2 on my old list.
Yeah, like that's so high up.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Number 1 was Lord of the Rings.
I think that's fair enough.
The trilogy.
Yeah.
And I still love Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
And I'll say this. I really tried hard not to have a trilogy on my list this time.
Okay.
And it's not the Lord of the Rings trilogy. There is a trilogy. You will hear about it. I will justify it. The trilogy is an important form in cinema history.
Sure.
But those are our old lists.
Yes.
So, Sean, do you want to dive into the new list? Because I have no idea what's on yours.
Yeah, I have no idea what's on yours.
It's also a surprise.
Yeah, I'm very excited to get into these lists and talk about these movies.
Yep.
So,
Sean, what's your number 10?
My number 10. Okay, so before we start on these lists, I just have... So, again, making this list was really hard, and I found like 2 days ago, I sort of like was thinking about how am I going to talk about these movies on this podcast, because so many of these movies are really dense. There's so much to talk about, and we have to talk about 20 fucking movies, and so we can't just go on for 2 hours talking about every movie, obviously. And so the conclusion I arrived at is I have basically written like a blurb, a paragraph, or some of them are a bit longer than one paragraph, but basically a paragraph of text about each of these movies that is the most like, this is where we'll probably like dig into that I am the English literature major and you're the film major, because these are like very creative writing-y kind of, they're not like essays. They're because these movies are like, my reaction to these movies are so personal, so I had to sort of distill that reaction into, I think, like the most focused piece of text I could kind of make. And so for each of these movies, I'm going to read that blurb I've written first, and then we can talk about, like, you know, go on the bigger rantings and ravings about the more technical aspects and everything else with the movies. But that's kind of the format here. And there's an interesting thing about my number 10. My number 10 is the only animated movie on my list. And I knew I needed an animated movie on my list, but I had a very hard time narrowing down what was the animated movie to be there. And I was considering a lot of Miyazaki movies, but it was that thing of like, when I was being brutally honest with myself, while I really love and respect like all of the Miyazaki movies I've seen and like other Ghibli movies like Graves and the Fireflies, they don't necessarily like spark that a deep passion in me. And so narrowing down, like figuring out what the animated movie on my list was going to be was really hard. And then I think I came to the right conclusion.
Dragon Ball Z, Tree of Might.
No, it wasn't Tree of Might. It's Bio Broly. I've come to terms with the truth. That is the best. Not only is the best Dragon Ball Z movie, but the best animated movie. No, it's not Bio Broly. It is maybe Bio Broly is the closest analog of the Dragon Ball Z movies to my number 10. To segue into my number 10, which is Ghost in the Shell, starring Scarlett Johansson, of course. The 2017. No, but it is Ghost in the Shell. So I will now read
the real Ghost in the Shell.
The real Ghost in the Shell, the 1995 movie directed by Mamoru Oshii. And so I will now read my blurb. My favorite scene in Ghost in the Shell is the scene where nobody is talking and nothing happens. The Major walks the city and simply observes, and we observe her observing. She is aloof. She is alone. She is both a part of the city and apart from the city. Ghost in the Shell is a movie where the story is told in the aesthetic. It is the tone, it is the music, it is the feel of the movie, and its very texture that communicates its theme. It is a theme of isolation and a theme of evolution. Ghost in the Shell is about the ways technology defines us and the ways technology evolves that definition. The Major is, by her voice and appearance, a woman, and yet the Major has no voice. She has no appearance because her body is not her body. Her body is technology. Her body is a tool. It can no more define her than my iPhone can define me, and yet she seems trapped in that body. As she wanders the city alone, simply observing, you can feel her observed back because you observe her back. And just as observing light defines its form as a wave or particle, the city and you define the Major in your observation as woman. That woman is not who she is. She is a shell. It is a ghost. And so that's my sort of take on Ghost in the Shell and the reason why I think that movie is so powerful. And it's something that when we talked about it earlier this year, I guess, when the new movie came out, and it was something where I had seen it in high school, but didn't really get it, and then rewatching it. So I've now seen it 3 times because I rewatched it earlier this year to sort of like get my head into like, what the fuck is going on with this live action movie, and then rewatch it again for this list to sort of be like, is this really my number 10 movie? Is this the like animated movie of choice? And I really think Ghost in the Shell, of all the pieces of fiction I've engaged with that deals with that very specific idea of the cyborg in society, Ghost in the Shell to me is the most incisive and precise sort of examination of that phenomena. And it's the one that most makes me feel like it understands where society was going and where we are now, where we are cyborgs effectively, like the way that we are attached to our technology, to our iPhones, to our laptops, to the tools and technology of our society that makes our society work. Ghost in the Shell so grasps how that changes what we are as people. But the thing I love about it is that Ghost in the Shell is not a cynical movie about that. Like, it is actually a very optimistic movie by its conclusion, that it does not do the kind of the Black Mirror thing of saying, oh, technology is going to just destroy us. It says, in some ways, technology is going to be our salvation, because while it like the society in Ghost in the Shell seems run down and dirty, the Major, her transformation and evolution at the end of the movie signals something of her transcending the kind of like base physical reality that we live in, attached to our bodies, that creates the sort of like prejudices we have in the way we see people. Instead, she is able to see people, and hopefully at the end of the movie be seen by at least the puppet master, the villain, as her ghost and not her shell, and as like the actual sort of like entity she is, and not just what she appears on the outside. Because her body, like I say in here, her body is not like an actual organic body. Nothing of what she is or who she is defined by the shell they put her in. It's all that like this sort of indescribable ghost or soul that is who she is. And I think the way the movie explores those themes without relying on heavy dialogue and telling it totally visually with like editing and with the fantastic score by Kenji Kawai, I think it's just a phenomenal movie.
Couple of thoughts.
Yeah.
One, I'm interested to see how many movies on each other's lists the other person hasn't seen.
Yeah.
Because I'll say Ghost in the Shell is a movie I've never seen.
Yeah.
I did actually buy the Blu-ray when it was on sale around the time of the Scarlett Johansson movie. So we can thank that movie for that.
Yeah,
it got
there
the
you
Blu-ray into people's hands.
Yes, that's always like, it's like when the movie makes the book sell like 200%.
Right.
It's there's, even if the movie's shit, it does some good in the world.
Yes. And I have not watched it. Everyone has gaps in their cinematic
Yeah.
canon. I definitely will someday. But I am interested to see how, because I know there are ones on
Yeah.
my list you haven't seen. So we'll see where
Yeah.
that goes.
One other thing I want to quickly say while I'm thinking about it with Ghost in the Shell is I want to point out one scene. I think if you're like thinking about the animation and how the animation tells the story, there's one scene and one quick shot basically that's just really a handful of frames near the end of the movie where she is jumping onto the spider tank and trying to like rip it apart with her physical strength, and it's just this really quick sequence of her straining, trying to pull it apart, and she strains so hard that her mechanical body literally rips itself to pieces. And like the visual metaphor in that of her body not being able to withstand the pressure that her self is trying to express in it, and it's just literally her like robotic muscles rip her robotic bones apart because they're too powerful. It's such a like visceral scene, and I really love it.
My other thought I was going to say is,
Yeah.
this is the first Japanese film you're going to hear about today.
Yes, there's going to be a lot.
I wonder how many between the two of us, because I will just say it's a significant percentage of my list.
It's a significant. Like, I read and speak Japanese, so
Yeah.
at some point it has to be a specific percentage of my list at this point in time. So, yes.
7 of my films are foreign, and you'll see how many of those are Japanese.
Yeah.
So anyway, anything else to say about Ghost in the Shell?
No, it's a great movie. People should watch it. It's definitely a movie that if you watch it, like, you gotta be in the mood for it. Because again, there's not a lot of dialogue. The dialogue that is there is like basically impenetrable. It's like kind of nonsense. It's like very like techie philosophy kind of stuff. But it is so much about just getting into that flow and getting into, when you get into that scene in the middle of the movie where she just walks around the city for like 5 to 10 minutes and there's no action, there's no dialogue at all, and it's just the music and it's just you looking at shots of her just kind of walking around the city. If you are like totally bought into the movie at that point, I think you're going to love the movie to death.
So Sean,
Yes.
my number 10.
Your number 10.
So starting off my list, my number 10 is a movie we have mentioned quite a bit on the podcast recently, and it is Mulholland Drive
Oh, yes.
from 2001 by the great David Lynch.
A movie that if I had seen this movie probably 3 years earlier, there's a very good chance it would have been on my list.
Yes. Mulholland Drive is probably my favorite of David Lynch's movies. I could make a case for Blue Velvet being the best of his movies. But Mulholland Drive is one that holds somewhat of a special place in my heart. I had seen some of Lynch's films before I came to Mulholland Drive. Lynch is a film school staple because there's a Lynch movie for every film school occasion.
Right.
He is so steeped in the psychoanalytic and theoretical constructs of film studies that you got to show some of his movies. But when I saw Mulholland Drive, I think it sparked something in me in that I fully realized just how deep his humor runs, because I think this is a hilarious movie. Just how deep his warmth runs, because I think this is an emotionally devastating movie. And just what a magnificent director he can be, even with a production like this that is low budget, that is for much of its runtime very televisual, that is not big on necessarily, visual splendor and things like that, which I would say Blue Velvet kind of is. Blue Velvet is this big widescreen movie, beautiful use of color. Mulholland Drive is not that film, and yet it tells something so inherently cinematic because this is, first and foremost, the greatest film ever made about the process of dreaming.
Yes.
And it is a movie where you do not see the dreamer, you do not see the act of dreaming. You could argue there are moments where maybe you do, maybe you don't. But dreams and dream realities and the process of what dreams are both individually and communally is what Mulholland Drive is about. One of the ways I think you can think of this movie is that it is, to me, the Lynchian version of Vertigo. And Vertigo, great movie. It was in the last Sight and Sound poll, it actually came out on top, beating out Citizen Kane for the first time in like 40 years. And I love Vertigo. It's probably my favorite of the Hitchcock films I've seen. But Vertigo, I think, is still somewhat stuck in that very Hitchcockian mode of kind of, I think, fairly literal visual representation in a lot of what it has. Whereas Mulholland Drive is also about identity transference. And yet what it does is it breaks those doors apart and does it all through this wild subconscious ride. I love looking at all the literature and conversation on this movie, reducing it to simple binaries. Like, Betty, the Naomi Watts character, is also Diane, and Rita is also Camilla. When really, everyone in this movie is wearing two or more faces throughout, is constantly taking on and taking off roles and these metaphorical masks. Like, this is a movie you could do almost like, if a Japanese director ever wanted to adapt this as a no performance,
right,
all with masks, there's a weird way you could do that, because it is one of the ways I think this movie shows how great Lynch is with actors is the way he asks them to adopt and take off personas completely through their body language. And one of the great scenes in this or any movie is the audition scene where Betty goes to do this audition for this director. And one of the things that happens in the movie up to that point is that Lynch is asking his actors to do a very specific thing with their style, which is that it is kind of like Twin Peaks. It's a little soapy, it's a little stilted, it's very broad in terms of, if you look like how Naomi Watts plays Betty as so excited about everything in the world around her. Diane is the other Betty. See, it's hard to talk about.
Yeah.
Rita, the Laura Herring character, is so much this like blank who is so fascinated by everything she kind of sees and so innocent and gentle, and they're really playing those archetypes up. And you think maybe to yourself, this isn't a quote-unquote realistic style of acting, this is so crazy. And what Lynch does to deconstruct the very method of acting in that audition scene is that we're doing all of that up to the point where Betty and this random actor go into that scene, and then they jump into the most like calcified, perfect version of what we think of as like post-1950s modern movie acting, which is that kind of like the method school of acting and the really what we think of as naturalistic and realistic. And that scene is devastating in all these different ways, partially because you realize, oh, it's fake too. All of this is fake. There's artifice to literally everything you see in the movies, to literally everything you see coming out of people. This is a mask the Naomi Watts character is putting on here just as she's been wearing before. And that is one of those fundamental deconstructions this movie is interested in. It is also a great movie about movies, even though I would argue Hollywood is much more on the fringes of this movie than you might think. Because a lot of it, most of the Betty Diane story has nothing to do with Hollywood, even though it is touching them in every way, because one of the arguments about this film's presentation of LA is that it's inescapable. I love how this film is a series of almost like short films or sketches built around stereotypical or cliched Hollywood LA plot lines we know of, like the young blonde ingenue comes to Hollywood, the mysterious brunette woman loses her memory, the genius director has his picture stolen from him, the man comes home to find his wife sleeping with the repairman, the assassination to get an important piece of information, and so on and so on. The movie's taking all these cliches and playing with them and watching Lynch start from these intensely familiar places and just not even subvert so much as push them in strange and unexpected directions and play on these themes of blurring reality and dreams. And it all comes to a head in this scene late in the film. It's easy to say this movie actually has two halves. It's more like a 2/3 section and a 1/3 section.
Yeah.
And the key scene is no hay banda. There is no band. And they go to Club Silencio and they hear from this guy who explains that they're going to see a show where everything they watch is a recording, everything is false, but it's going to be mixed up together. And it is the most utterly ludicrous scene. It is the most Lynchian scene that Lynch ever lynched.
Right.
But it is also ludicrously emotional because it reveals for these characters, for us, everyone consumed in this atmosphere, how something that is not real, that something that is an illusion, that is illusory, that is dreamlike, can affect us deeply, because where this scene goes is a woman starts singing, and Lynch loves scenes where you have someone up on stage in the proscenium singing to characters in the POV, and they all lose their shit. And that is a thing that he does a lot in Twin Peaks, in Blue Velvet. Here in Twin Peaks The Return, he ends every episode with that. But this is, I think, the most powerful version of that scene, because the woman is lip-syncing throughout that whole scene, and you know it, and they pull the rug out from under you at some point, and yet the characters and you are all overcome by this image and this idea, and it is what the movie is about. And I don't really care to go into the specifics of what is the second half in relation to the first half, and who was really, is this the real part, or is this, no, it's all a dream. It's one of the things I love about the second half, is that it feels like you are simultaneously waking up and falling into a further level of your REM sleep cycle.
Right.
All of that is true. And sitting with the movie and thinking about all the things it has to give you. I think it's a movie you could write an essay about pretty much every scene on. It is so dense.
Yeah.
And I love it. And I really had to have a Lynch on here. And it was not a hard decision. Mulholland Drive is one of my 10 favorite movies.
Absolutely, yeah. It is, like I said, if it was a movie I had encountered earlier and I had not seen it for the first time only 2 months ago, which is like I could not ever justify myself just like throwing a movie on there that quick. But it is the manner in which it is able to sort of replicate and interrogate the logic of dreams, and then like by like sheer like virtue of its own existence, and then like the setting and everything, it is doing that thing of where it is making you sort of like really confront the fact that movies are dreams, like, and then that movies work in dream logic, because movies do not work in real world logic. They never have. They can't, by the sheer fact of what they are and the form they exist in. And Lynch being able to sort of realize that artistically is such an unbelievable accomplishment to me. When I saw that movie, I was just completely floored by its ability to understand like that something so like basically human, that it's David Lynch's sort of ability to interrogate humanity and understand humanity on a level that most artists never really can get, and his ability to understand how to present a dream in a movie is evidence of that fact.
Absolutely. And if you are enjoying Twin Peaks The Return along with us as we talk about that every week on the show and have not seen Mulholland Drive, I actually think Mulholland Drive is a clearer precedent for Twin Peaks The Return than actual Twin Peaks.
I agree. Yeah.
So it's worth watching for a number of reasons. So Sean, what is your number 9?
My number 9, this was one of the movies I was kind of surprised at when I was looking at my list that this was going to make it on here. But when I kept on looking at it, this movie just kept on speaking to me, because I've come back to it. I've watched this movie about 4 times now. And so I basically kind of watched it once a year since I watched it for the first time. It is David Cronenberg's The Fly, starring Jeff Goldblum. It's a remake of the 1950s original sci-fi classic.
The wonderful Jeff Goldblum.
Yes, the Jeff Goldblum's best performance. That's not a knock against Jeff Goldblum. That is a compliment to his fantastic abilities as being like basically a romantic lead in this movie, as top of just being like the lead character of the movie. But anyways, I'm going to now read my little blurb I wrote for it. Where Ghost in the Shell sees bodies as shells which hold luminous ghosts, David Cronenberg figures bodies as mutable, mutatable, soft, squishy sacks. The boundary between body and mind is not a hard line, it is a thin membrane. Easily penetrated, and when penetrated, the soul is consumed in a flood of base matter. Seth Brundle's grotesque evolution into the uncanny is a thing of marvel. As the indelible special effects work convince the audience of Brundle's bodily devolution, Goldblum's acting convinces of his psychological deterioration. The mind does not survive the body. The self is built in carnal reality. Therein lies the horror. The Fly has been seen as a metaphor for cancer, puberty, and AIDS, but The Fly is nothing so simple. It is not a metaphor for some specific bodily affliction. It is bodily affliction itself, the essence of illness and decay rendered in unflinching detail. Cronenberg shows us that we are not luminous beings. We are flies trapped in the cage of our own flesh. So yeah, David Cronenberg's The Fly, if it's a movie that... Have you seen The Fly?
I have not.
No, this is another one. It has like just beyond like its sort of merits in terms of its thematic explorations of what I was talking about there, of sort of showing and like really making you kind of confront the horror that we all have to understand, that we are like, we think of ourselves as this like sort of separate personality and this separate sort of like intellectual being, but when you are sick, when you are injured, when something happens to you that brings you back into your, like, physically into your body, you realize, like, we are trapped in here, and, like, what happens to our body affects this, like, intellectual self that we like to sort of project onto ourselves. So in some ways, The Fly is like the anti-Ghost in the Shell, which is, I had not thought about that when I was first making the list, but then when I was writing these, I kind of realized that's how these paired out. But even beyond that, like, how I think masterfully it explores that really dense and fascinating sort of thematic material. Just as a movie, the special effects and just like, and the pacing and the editing. I mean, obviously David Cronenberg is an incredibly accomplished director, and being paired with, I mean, it won the Academy Award for best special effects for the year it came out, and it's the special effects of how Jeff Goldblum just slowly over the course of the movie just gets grosser and grosser until just like his fingernails start coming off and his nose falls off and like his skin is just becomes mottled and gray and little fly hairs start poking out of him until by the end of the movie he like is transformed utterly into a monster that is completely unrecognizable as anything that was ever once human. But the thing is, he doesn't become a fly. It's not like, I mean, I think the original 1950s sci-fi movie is a classic for a reason. It's also fantastic. But in that movie, you know, it's a human body with like a paper mache fly head on top of it, and that's how they represent that transformation. And here, it's not clean. It is not clean. There's no hard line between where the human part of him is and where like the fly part of him is, as he's been sort of like fused together in the transformation pod. And so slowly over the course of the movie, both of those things of like the fly DNA just starts slowly affecting his human self until he's just this weird, gross, fleshy mass of that's writhing on the floor in pain. And it's one of like the most horrifying movies, not because of like jump scares or anything like that. It is because it like you have to confront this very real human horror of being transformed into something that you do not recognize, which I think anyone who like it, particularly for me, it is a movie that makes me think a lot about when I was younger and my grandmother had cancer and going with my mom to visit her and seeing her in the hospital, and like I was very young when that happened. And it always makes me think about those things and those moments in your life where like you are confronted with that sort of physical, like material reality of your own mortality. And The Fly is able to capture that in such a gruesome, grotesque way. I think it's a phenomenal movie. But obviously, based on what I've been saying, it is not a movie you should see if you want to have a good time. It is a movie you want to see if you want to like dive into some of that super fucking gross shit, because it is the grossest movie I've ever seen. Yeah. In every meaning of the word.
Well, nice. You have a dark list so far.
Yes, I do have a kind of a dark list.
All right, my number 9 is The Double Life of Veronique, Le Double Vie de Veronique, from 1991 by Polish director Krzysztof Kieslowski. This was the first film he made outside of Poland. It is a French film, technically, although it has a portion set in Poland that is Polish. Krzysztof Kieslowski is one of the great directors of world cinema. And between 1988 and 1994, the year of his death, he made all 10 films of the Decalogue series, which was a series for Polish television, which you should see. It's been released on Criterion. The Decalogue is a masterpiece. He made this film, The Double Life of Veronique, and then he made the Three Colors trilogy, probably the most famous thing he did in life. The blue, red, and white, or blue, white, and red in that order, a little different than the American order of those colors. And that adds up for 14 remarkable masterpieces made in a 6-year period, at the point of which, once he debuted Red at Cannes, he just went and died, because it's like, I've made enough movies, I assume.
He just like put his soul into those movies so much he just couldn't live anymore.
It really is true. I think it's one of the most remarkable creative stretches in film history, especially for just the sheer speed and concentration of brilliance and innovation, and that this is the stretch of his filmography that most people are familiar with. I've seen a little bit of his earlier stuff. He did a lot of documentary work before these, but that alone, those 14 films are a au revoir in and of themselves, and my favorite is this one, The Double Life of Veronique. I first saw this in a class in film school called Cinema and the Poetics of Transcendence, and I don't think there's any more fitting film to show in terms of expressing that idea in our daily lives. There are movies like Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey that reach for transcendence in a bigger, more cosmic fashion. There's another movie like that later on my list we'll talk about. But in terms of the mundane transcendence of everyday life, the sense of something bigger than this physical world that flows throughout our bodies and the space around us, to me, this is the number one production on that topic ever made. Trying to describe what this film is about is nearly impossible. I think it's so much down to what you make of it, but I can describe the basics. Irene Jacob stars as two women, one named Veronique, one named Weronika. One is Polish, one is French. They are identical. They're both played by Irene Jacob. They are the same age, all of those things. But they only intersect briefly once. One is on the bus and one is on a street in Warsaw, and that's it. Otherwise, they are not really aware of each other's existence. The first third or so of the film is about Weronika, and she is a singer, and she is sort of moving up in the world. She gets this chance to sing, and then her heart gives out on stage, and she passes away. And the second two-thirds of the film, there is some kind of transference that happens, and Veronique has some kind of spiritual awakening over in France, and she goes on something of a little journey to, I think, awaken herself to the ways of wonder in the world. And that is maybe the best way to say it. The other way I described this the other day, my brother was asking me what this movie was, and I said, it's about one woman who's actually two women. And it's a very weird way to describe the movie,
Sure.
But it's also a very simple logline you can give. There's so many ways you can read it. Are they just two women who look the same and share a metaphysical connection? Is it one soul split across two bodies, two similar bodies moving through life more differently than you might realize at first? The truth is, the section with Weronika, the Polish woman, is fairly short. People like to say this is another movie with two halves, and it's not. The Weronika section is half an hour or so, and the moments of convergence between the two women are really brief, completely metaphysical. To me, the film itself is more about the second woman, Veronique, who inherits some part of the soul of Weronika. And Weronika is this woman who is so in tune with the wonder of the world. And she will stop and look out the window of the train as she rides to Warsaw. And she will look at light reflections. And in the first shot of the film, after the opening credits, she just stands in the rain and is completely at one with that. And she's walking down this little corridor in Warsaw, and she watches like dust falls from the ceiling. And she is in tune with these things. And you get the sense that Veronique, maybe a little bit, but she starts to awaken to that. And it is a film with an interesting, uneven arc, because I think there are a lot of ways to read where the movie goes in the end. My view is actually that Veronique kind of realizes she's kind of chasing wonder through this relationship with this weird puppeteer guy, or marionnettiste, as they say in French,
Sure,
which I love. It's a term for that. And it seems like it's actually kind of a false arc, because he, I think, ultimately is interested in her more for her story than for her soul and body. And yet, the last scene of the movie is her reaffirming some sense of a larger wonder in the world. Wonder is a topic I think is fascinating and I hold dear in cinema. I took another class about cinema and wonder, and it's a word that can be used very flippantly in daily life, but I think has a deeper meaning of the sublime and the things that we sense that are bigger than ourselves. And this is, the Criterion edition of Double Life of Veronique describes it as a metaphysical masterpiece, and that is absolutely a way to describe it. It also has some of the best cinematography you will ever see from the great Sławomir Idziak, who later shot the fifth Harry Potter movie, if you want a mainstream connection.
There you go.
Because the later Harry Potter movies kind of were a who's who of great world cinematographers. And Idziak, as he often did for Krzysztof Kieslowski, he also shot Blue in the Three Colors trilogy, and Decalogue 5, which is also a short film about killing. And he's a great cinematographer. What he does in this film, particularly with filters and with color, is out of this world. It is one of the most colored, textured movies ever. I should say that my list is going to be split, half black and white films, half color. And this is one of my favorite of the color films, and maybe the one, at least of the live action films on here, that uses color the most fantastically. I really, really love that about this film. And then Zbigniew Priesner, the musician who wrote the score for this film and for Kieslowski's other films of this period, is a wonderful score. And also, this is one of the closest relationships between a film's text and its score you will ever see, because the music kind of exists diegetically in the world in interesting spiritual ways. And I love the shit out of this movie. It's a movie that when I saw it in film school, I liked, but grew on me and called me back to it. And I have seen this movie at least 5 times, and I am always happy to rewatch it because it is a different thing every time you see it. And one of the great movies. And I kind of get to knock 2 countries off the list here, France and Poland. So
Sure.
there you go.
There you go. Yeah, obviously I have not seen that one.
Okay.
I have not dipped my toes very deep into Polish film yet. I hope to get there one day.
Kieslowski is kind of the guy if you did like on the surface of
Yeah.
Polish film. I don't know a lot else about Polish film. And of course he, in this later period of his life, had this connection with French cinema because the French love to fund other people's movies. As Mulholland Drive is also a French production.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's my number 9. Sean.
Okay, my number 8 is Alien.
It's a good movie.
It's a very good movie. Now, you have very recently seen it, so if we had done this podcast like a month ago, this would have been the third movie on my list you hadn't seen.
Yeah.
But no, luckily we can both talk about it. So I'm going to read my little blurb I wrote. In space, no one can hear you scream. Our language defines us as a species. Through communication, we build society, culture, and we dominate our environment. Our voice makes us strong. Our voice makes us human. But in space, no one can hear you scream. In space, we are alien. No filmmaker has ever rendered this fear on screen with such virtuosity as Ridley Scott. When John Hurt stumbles into that derelict spacecraft, we become small, cowering monkeys in front of something we do not and cannot understand. Space is vast and holds endless horrors in its infinite darkness. The truest horror of all, though, is that darkness is reflected in us, because the monster of Alien is not that black, stalking creature. That thing is simply obeying its biological imperative. The true monster is the machine that sets it all in motion, then watches with bated breath. The monster which preys on the crew of the Nostromo and turns a deaf ear to their muffled screams is the company. It's capitalism. It's us. Because in the company, we hear you screaming. We just don't care.
Damn.
Yeah. So that's Alien. We talked about it. When did we talk about that? Like a month ago or something?
It would be 2 months ago when Alien
Yeah.
Covenant came out.
Yeah, exactly.
And we did a little thing talking about all of the Alien movies. And of course, we've bitched about Prometheus on this show
Exactly.
before.
So we've talked about Alien in different ways, and Alien is a movie that I think my relationship with Alien is interesting because it's changed so much. That like it used to be a movie when I first watched it. Like I liked it. Like I thought it was really well made, but I didn't necessarily was like super in love with it. And then I watched Aliens. I was like, no, this is also good. Maybe not quite as good as that first one, but it's pretty good. And then for like a lot of different reasons of like different circumstances of like other people I knew watched them and were talking to me about them, like, oh yeah, I need to watch those movies. Or there's one class that I was taking on Gothic horror where we ended up watching Alien and Aliens for that class. And it just was something that like periodically I kept on rewatching those movies. And kind of like with Terminator and Terminator 2, there are movies that whenever I watch the first one, I feel sickly compelled to watch the second one, even though every single time I do that, I like the first one even more and the second one even less.
I agree so strongly with that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's such a weird experience, but I always have to watch them in pairs. But it does have this effect of Alien as like every time I watch it, I dig deeper and deeper into that movie, and it's something where it is something of it's a combination of the filmmaking of it, and it is, I think it's such a masterful horror movie that we talked about when we talked about this movie 2 months ago. We talked a lot about the scene I sort of like to talk about here where John Hurt goes and leaves the ship and goes and finds the crashed derelict spaceship, and that's where the alien egg is and everything. And that whole sequence is still, I think, shocking. It's still intense. It still grabs you in a way that horror filmmaking so rarely is able to sustain that kind of tension, let alone sustain it across like 30 plus years now. And so it's just capacity, I think, as a film to tap into some of those sort of like subconscious ways to terrify you, and the way that dialogue is handled, that you can never quite make out what people are saying because they're always talking over one another, and the dialogue isn't necessarily important because it's so naturalistic and it's so weird, and you're trapped and confined in the spaceship. All of those things and those elements of the horror filmmaking, I think, are absolutely top notch, and it's one of the reasons why I would consider this to basically probably be the best horror movie I've seen in terms of those elements. But the thing that I think I've always loved and respected that side of the movie. The thing that, like, every time I come back to the movie, I sort of see more and more of is that the thing I talk about at the end of my little blurb, that movie is about so much more than just, like, fighting an alien on a spaceship, you know? Like, that's the thing that when you watch it in high school, that's the thing you latch onto because it's exciting. But that the ways that movie very quietly critiques capitalism in the background as having created this entire scenario, and then of course it's sort of embodied in the Ian Holmes character who, spoiler for Alien, he's the android, and he's sort of you find out that they have been sent there and ordered by the company to investigate this ship, and the company probably knew that all these people were going to die. And every time I watch the movie, you just see more and more that is what the movie is about, and I think is one of the smartest, quietest critiques of capitalism, because you're so distracted by the giant, scary alien monster. Like, the alien monster is like, whatever. Like, if the alien monster is not really the reason all these people are dead, they would have been dead no matter what. Because they're being ordered around by this company that doesn't see them as anything valuable. That only sees them as something to gain them profit, and is willing to throw their lives away at a whim just to find out if maybe this, like, weird thing on this one planet is going to be something that can get them some profit. And those elements of the movie, I always find, every time I rewatch it, become more and more remarkable and stand out more to me. And that's the kind of stuff that I like about horror movies as a genre, and like horror not just as a film genre, but horror as a genre in general, is that it is able to be this like really sharp critique of society that gets under your skin and gets in you, that you don't necessarily notice all the time on your first watch when you're younger, and then when you get deeper and deeper into it, you realize that's what the movie has always been about in such a like giant, like flashing sign kind of way. You're sort of shocked that that's not what you pulled out of the movie the first time around.
Absolutely. I think Alien is not just one of the great mainstream American films, but one of the boldest. I think it is artistically so fascinating. It is so, I throw this term around a lot, but I do think a lot of Alien plays very avant-garde with itself. In the first hour, in particular, just exploring that ship and long tracking shots through it that are so much about atmosphere and not really about story or character or those things. And I think Ridley Scott, in some ways, is a tremendously disappointing director to me, because I think Alien and Blade Runner are easily his two best movies, and they're like his first two movies. And he had such this experimental streak in him then, and such a non-commercial streak, because Alien is in no way codified. It is not, and even though Alien is a franchise with lots of sequels, no other Alien movie really at all resembles Alien.
Yeah.
And actually the closest might be Alien 3, ironically, and it's not that good a movie. But like, I think with Alien and Blade Runner, he had these visions of future stories that were so much about visuals and atmosphere and quiet storytelling, where, the script for Alien might be 20 pages long. The script for Blade Runner might be 30 pages long. Like, they are not complicated scripts. They are so much about the visual storytelling. And I think Ridley Scott, I think very quickly after that became a big commercial Hollywood director and has sometimes made fantastic films. I think Kingdom of Heaven is his great work of the 21st century and one of the best films of the 2000s. But other than that, I really do a lot of the time I look at like Alien Covenant, which has a couple of the little like flourishes of early Ridley Scott, and I just think, man, this is a guy who had something so special, and at some point maybe got it beaten out of him by Hollywood. And I understand, because he had trouble making all of these movies.
Yeah.
But Alien is something worth celebrating, and so, especially in its moment in time when everyone was just trying to make the Star Wars ripoff.
Right.
This was not a Star Wars ripoff.
No, it is the exact opposite of Star Wars ripoff. That's why it's great.
All right. My number 8 is the film trilogy on my list.
Okay.
And I'll explain why I cheated, and it's really because I couldn't avoid cheating. And that is my number 8 film. We go to our third place on the globe. We travel to India.
Okay.
And my number 8 is the Apu trilogy, as it is called, from 1955, 1956, and 1959, by the greatest of Indian directors, Satyajit Ray. Wonderful Indian director. These were his 3 of his first films. The first 2 were his first 2 films, and he made some in between films 2 and 3. The Apu trilogy, the 3 films are Pather Panchali, also known as Song of the Little Road, Aparajito, also known as The Unvanquished, and Apur Sansar, The World of Apu. And these films tell the story of a young boy in India, Apu, and his journey through life. We see this character grow from birth. We see him born in Pather Panchali to the point in Apur Sansar where he reaches an interesting point of maturity with his own child, his own son. And it is one of the great achievements of world cinema in so many ways. Pather Panchali was the birth of a new Indian cinema. There had been cinema in India before then, but not of this artistic caliber, and that was this focused on the daily life of people in the country. Satyajit Ray grew up in Calcutta, which is a big cultural hub of India. I had a professor who was a Ray scholar who also grew up in Calcutta, actually knew Ray a little bit before he died. And So Satyajit Ray saw so many movies from around the world, and he founded like Calcutta's first film club. And when Jean Renoir came to India in the early 50s to make The River, his film in India, Satyajit Ray helped him do location scouting and stuff. So by the time Satyajit Ray made his first film, he knew what he wanted to do. He had so much knowledge and skill, and Pather Panchali does not play like the work of an amateur. It is, to me, the greatest first film by any director I have ever seen, because it is a work of such maturity and such cinematic strength and power. And the sequels only get better in some of the way they deploy film language, even though I think you could make the argument for Pather Panchali being the best and most significant of these three. But let's talk about why I had to put the whole trilogy on here. Okay. Because the thing is, I saw 2 of these 3 films in film school, and I kind of bounced off of both of them. Pather Panchali, I had trouble getting into. Apur Sansar I found very interesting, but also it didn't hit me as hard as I think it does now. Some of that is I've grown up. Some of that is also for many, many years these films were available in the absolute shittiest quality. Pather Panchali and Apur Sansar, when I saw those in film school, basically off of bootleg DVDs from the UK. Like, they looked so bad, and the negatives of these films had burned in a fire when they were transferred to the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in the 90s. And for 20 years, they were kind of thought lost on the level of their negatives. In 2015, the Criterion Collection did this huge heroic restoration where they were actually able to salvage a good deal of those negatives they sent them off to like the Cineteca di Bologna in Italy, and they rehydrated the burned film so it could be scanned, and they took other like inner positives and 35mm prints and dupe negatives and stuff and mixed them all together to make the best presentations possible. It is the absolute greatest feat of film restoration that I have ever seen, and I watched through that Blu-ray set when it came out and again recently, and was so taken by these films. Some of it, being able to see them in that clarity of like, this is the way they are supposed to look, is part of it. They are beautiful, beautiful black and white films. His cinematography is out of this world, and he worked with the same cinematographer through both these 3 films and most of his career, and they are just absolutely stunning portraits of Indian life in 3 very different areas. Pather Panchali happens in a very poor rural Indian household. Aparajito takes place in 2 cities, one of them being Calcutta, and Apur Sansar takes place mostly in Calcutta and some other places. And so you get these great, very very much inspired by Italian neorealism on location views of India, and that's a wonderful thing. But getting back to what I was saying, I kind of bounced off 2 of these films when I saw them in film school, but then watching the trilogy start to finish in context, I did it over the course recently of 2 days basically, and watched the 3 films, and they are a being. Each movie does stand on its own and is a great work of art in and of itself, but it is only, I think, in context that they become the full, true, transcendent masterpieces that they are. I kind of resisted putting a whole trilogy on there, but I think it can be justified in these ways. So first, it's important to note that Ray did use many of the same collaborators on these films, and his style does evolve in some ways, but these 3 films are visually and orally unified to a large degree. These are also all scored by the great Ravi Shankar, who is probably an Indian composer you have heard of. Worked with George Harrison a lot near the end of his life, and the music is amazing. I love Indian music. Second, the story that they tell is at its most powerful in the context of this trilogy, this story of a life from birth to maturity, each part supporting the others. The story of Apu is almost like an Indian story of Job, because the first movie, Pather Panchali, as he's growing up, his beloved sister dies, and they have to leave their ancestral home and go to the big city. There, his father dies in the second film, and then at the end of that second film, his mother, after supporting him in many years so Apu could get his education, his mother passes away from illness, and Apu is alone. And then the third film, Apur Sansar, he kind of gets married out of the blue because he goes with a friend to the friend's cousin's wedding, and it turns out the arranged marriage for this woman is, this man is crazy, and they need someone to marry her because in these customs, she will be kind of put aside if she doesn't get married on this special day. So Apu marries this woman. She has a child and dies after he falls deeply in love with her. And then Apu is broken, and the last act of Apur Sansar is him kind of trying to come back to terms with his own humanity. So you can see this arc does continue. It's like, and in fact, any weakness to any of these films, the middle film, Aparajito, is the hardest to enjoy on its own because it is this series of almost interstitial stories getting us from the end of Pather Panchali to the beginning of Apur Sansar. And, of course, Aparajito is a really dark film because it's the deaths of both of his parents and as he grows up. So... But again, that they are a trilogy structure. In the same way as, 5 years ago I had Lord of the Rings. You kind of can't pick one out of them.
Yeah.
My third reason is that I do think that the trilogy is an important form of cinematic structure in world film history. And to have an example of this form, I think maybe the best use of the trilogy structure ever used in film history is recognition that films can expand beyond themselves in powerful ways. My fourth reason I had on here was that we've talked a lot recently in the specific discussion of Twin Peaks, the David Lynch show, that I think there's a kind of convergence going on between film and television. But you look back at something like the Apu trilogy, and it's a reminder that film has always played with serialized elements, and that sometimes the best way to tell a story is for filmmakers to reach beyond the confines of these single features. And I do think if you recognize one Apu film, you have to recognize them all in acknowledgement of how masterfully Ray enriched this story through its extension, which is something that, filmmakers up to today like to try to do, but I don't think capture to the same degree. One movie that is referenced sometimes in the same way, like an American equivalent today, would be Richard Linklater's Boyhood, which I don't think is a very good film, and I actually think you compare it to the Apu trilogy and how much better Ray was able to tell the story of a person growing up and not using as many, cinematic gimmicks, just doing good cinematic storytelling. And I think the Apu trilogy is something that I am still relatively new to in terms of how long I've had it in my life, and I think it will probably climb up this list as the years go by. But it is such a major accomplishment. It's something I carry with me from film school that I have warmed to over the years. And I think they are films I could easily rewatch a million times, but they are so beautiful, so wonderful. And if you have not seen them, that Criterion Collection set is one of the best things they've ever done. And again, one of the best film restorations you will ever see. So the Apu trilogy, I think, should be just required viewing for humanity because these films are so filled with lessons. They're like a long fable. And by the end, you don't come away with any one moral. You come away with 100. And that is why it is my number 8.
Well, having heard your argument, I will allow the Apu trilogy to occupy one spot on your list. It is accepted.
Okay.
It is in canon now.
Sounds good.
Okay. My number 7 movie is a movie people have probably heard of. Spider-Man 2.
Wow.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yes. This was one that was... This is like the gut check one of like... I looked at it on the list. I was like, this probably has to be on my list. And then I rewatched the movie. I was like, yep, it's on my list. So
I did rewatch it recently too. It's not on mine, but man, it's still the best superhero movie.
It is the best superhero movie, and that's why it is on my list. Because I needed some superhero movie on here because it is the all-consuming movie genre that we all live in now. And Spider-Man 2 is, I think, the master class version of it. So I'll read my blurb now. Aunt May said, "I believe there's a hero in all of us that keeps us honest, gives us strength, makes us noble, and finally allows us to die with pride, even though sometimes we have to be steady and give up the thing we want the most, even our dreams. Spider-Man lives inside of me. He sleeps in my heart. He sits and stares at me when there's something I think I have to do that I know I need to do, but just don't want to do it. On the best days, I do it, and we swing in the clouds together. On the worst days, I don't, and it breaks my heart seeing me reflected in his eyes. I strive to make the next day a best day. There's a hero in all of us. In me, it's Spider-Man. Being on the inside, it's lonely. I know he's there, but I can only see him in my mind's eye. But in the movie, in Spider-Man 2, he is jumping and swinging and crying and fighting for something better. He is made manifest in the screen uncannily, like my heart is painting the picture. And then for the briefest moments, I see it. Well, to be more accurate, my Spider-Man sees it. My Spider-Man sees another little Spider-Man there. He's sitting in Sam Raimi's heart. They wave at each other. There's a hero in all of us. So yeah, Spider-Man 2 is like the most personal pick probably for me on this list because it is, obviously if you've listened to this podcast for a while, you know Spider-Man's hugely important to me. He was hugely important to me growing up. I read Spider-Man comics voraciously as a child, like particularly like 5th and 6th grade. I just read probably like the first 200 issues or something ridiculous of Amazing Spider-Man in these big, clumsy omnibus formats that had like newspaper basically paper stock and all the color was taken out, but it was just you could get them super cheap and just read all these comics. And Spider-Man just really does mean so much to me in the sense of I do kind of use him, like I described here, as a kind of guidepost in my life, as like this moral symbol of like, what would Spider-Man do? Because
some people have Jesus, you have Spider-Man.
Exactly, and I think Spider-Man is in some ways a better role model because he's a more relatable role model. He's not some 2,000-year-old person who died on a cross. He's a teenager who's nerdy and kind of like ostracized by his peers, but also has this strength and ability to make the world better. But making the world better is hard. Making the world better hurts, and like doing the right thing hurts. Even if doing the right thing is not, for most people, it's not fighting Dr. Octopus. Doing the right thing is like doing your homework. You know, when you're in high school, doing the right thing is like, you know, being there for a friend. Doing the right thing is like loaning someone some gas money or something. It's, for most people, doing the right thing in your day-to-day life is small. It's, you know, emailing your senator or calling your senator and telling them, you know, hey, don't, you know, let's have healthcare be a thing in the United States. That would be nice to have people be able to live. Like, that's not some huge heroic act where you're going and saving New York City, but it is a fight worth fighting, and it's like the actions you can take. And Spider-Man, I think, shows it's this sort of moral tale about that those things can be hard, and juggling those things can be hard, and sometimes there will be a cost to your personal life or to things that you are the things that you want to be doing, but you know there are other things that you have to be doing. And Spider-Man 2, the movie, is just, to me, the most purest expression of that side of Spider-Man, and it is I think it's an incredible movie in terms of its filmmaking craft. Sam Raimi's ability to juggle the 100 different tones that are required of a comic book movie, and specifically of a heavier comic book movie like Spider-Man 2, that does not have the luxury of, you know, Batman movies of just being able to be dark and depressing and dour 100% of the time, which is how, you know, the Batman movie model is. Spider-Man can't be that, because that's not Spider-Man. Spider-Man has to be funny and lighthearted and joyful, but also brutal and cripplingly sad, because it has those bright moments, the moments where Peter has to suffer and Peter has to let Mary Jane down hurt all the more. And it also has to be frightening, and that's one of the best parts of Spider-Man 2, is that Sam Raimi gets to bring his, you know, great experience as a horror director from the Evil Dead series and brings it to bear in the unforgettable Dr. Octopus scene where the tentacles murder all the scientists in the surgery lab. And it's just, it really is an incredible movie. Every single time I watch it, I'm impressed more and more. Not just by the Spider-Man connection, that obviously that is the main reason it's on here, because it's so personal to me, but just when we are in this era of superhero filmmaking, Spider-Man 2, I think, is still by far the best example, and an example that I want other superhero movies to like go to even more, of being able to have that comic book tone. You don't have to be the Dark Knight and be super serious and try to make things realistic. You don't have to do that. You can be silly and funny and happy and weird and goofy. You can have one of like the goofiest moments in any movie I've ever seen is the like raindrops keep falling on my head montage.
It's so great. I love it.
In the middle of Spider-Man 2. It's utterly absurd. It's so silly. It could not exist in any other movie. You know, it has to be in a superhero movie because it just jumps off of that like comic book page. And Sam Raimi, like, what a just amazing director, being able to take all those different tones and manage them so that none of them overpower one another. And so Spider-Man 2 is a masterclass of filmmaking, but also a masterclass example of how to express the essence of Spider-Man as a character on screen.
You know, we really loved this year's Spider-Man Homecoming. And it's a fun movie. It is a funny movie. It's a blast, and I recommend it. It doesn't hold a candle to the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies.
No, it doesn't.
I think it is a fun film. I think it is not a film of particular substance. I think Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movies, less so Spider-Man 3, but 1 and 2, and 2 in particular, are films of immense substance.
Yeah.
They are films of immense filmmaking craft. I mean, he was just inventing on the fly how to show this kind of superhero action on screen. And I dare you, go back to any other superhero movie before like 2007,
right,
and try to tell me if any of the action is coherent or interesting, or the effects are less than cringeworthy, or more than cringeworthy. None of them are, except Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2. And
Yeah.
Spider-Man 1, little lesser because there are some effects wonkiness. Spider-Man 2 holds up completely.
Yeah, like just go watch the train scene from the
It's
last act
so
of that movie.
great, and it is all so motivated. Like, the train scene in Spider-Man 2 is not the, like, greatest piece of cinematic bombast put in a superhero movie.
No, it's not a giant laser shooting into the sky, opening up a hell portal. He's trying to stop one train from crashing.
But Peter Parker and Dr. Octavius are so motivated going into and out of that scene, and that is what matters most. This is a fantastic movie, and I do think the X factor missing from any modern, not just Spider-Man, but some other superhero movies, is a guy like Sam Raimi, who is just that good and just that creative, and also happens to love that material that much. And that's an intersection we don't get as much today. But I think Spider-Man 2 is a perfectly worthy pick for a top 10 list, because it is a hell of a movie.
Yes, it is.
All right. My number 7. My number 7 is the newest film on my list. It's from 2011. And it is, I think, the film of this decade so far, The Tree of Life by the director Terrence Malick. Now, I talk about Terrence Malick sometimes. I don't talk about it a lot, because it's actually a very personal thing for me.
Right.
He is probably my favorite American director, at least certainly of the contemporary era. I think he is a filmmaker who gets shit on a lot today and is a victim, I think, of the sheer dismissiveness of modern film criticism, which is that, you know, I think our instinct is either something is a masterpiece or it's a mess, and the answer is there's a lot of middle ground to that. I don't know if I would call The Tree of Life Malick's best movie. In fact, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't. I think his best movie is like his first 4 movies, Badlands, Days of Heaven, The Thin Red Line, and The New World, all probably have a firmer grasp on that title than The Tree of Life does. But here's what The Tree of Life did for me. It literally changed the way I see the world. And I don't mean philosophically or metaphorically, a little bit maybe, but I mean that Malick's vision of how he sees the world through his eyes, and the way Emmanuel Lubezki, the greatest living cinematographer, photographed this film and some of Malick's other films, literally rewired my brain, in that after seeing The Tree of Life, I look at the world differently while I move through it. And the first time I saw The Tree of Life, when it came out in 2011, I bounced right the fuck off it. I hated it. I did not get it. I did not like it. And yet, I started seeing the world differently. And 6 months later, after my dad's cancer came back, actually, I was called to this movie. And this is something you'll hear about a little bit else on this list. Sometimes I see movies, you know, in film school elsewhere, where I bounce off them and I dismiss them, and somehow they sit in my brain. And they don't leave until I go back to them, and then I have a revelatory experience. That's happened several times, and this was one of the most powerful. I rented The Tree of Life on my PS3 in my dorm room as a freshman one afternoon in December to rewatch it again, because it would not get out of my head. And it is still one of the most powerful... I'm watching on like a 20-inch little TV.
Right.
It's one of the most powerful experiences with film I have ever had, bar none. And so much in terms of how I connected to it in its vision of family, in its vision of the world, in its vision of transcendence through a single person and a single moment in time. All of that, but also visually. This is definitely my favorite of the color films on my list in terms of their visuals, probably, at least in live action. And I think Emmanuel Lubezki is just a tremendous, tremendous cinematographer. But the way he and Malick move their camera, and people make fun of it now, and I hate that, because there is so much... When people say, and I said this about The Tree of Life at the time, and I was wrong, and I will say that I was wrong, saying it's style over substance. I hate that critique. I hate that critique, because style has substance when it's done well.
Yeah.
They are one and the same in a lot of circumstances. And this is an example of that, because The Tree of Life and a lot of Malick's later modern mature work is about ways of seeing, and that there is a POV to these films, but it is somehow detached. And the way he moves his camera, kind of like it's dancing. Like I'm going to talk about a lot of films after this point where the camera never moves, because I like that style of cinematography a lot. In fact, most of the time I like that more. But Emmanuel Lubezki and Terrence Malick know how to move a camera. And the way it dances through a film like The Tree of Life, and the way it plays with light, and it looks like a painting of light on the canvas of film, is so phenomenally powerful. So here's a little anecdote about how I mean it changed the way I see the world. Well, Sean, when you and I lived together in the apartment up in Boulder,
yes,
we went to CU, Colorado, or University of Colorado, and we would walk up to school, and we went through the engineering building, because that was where kind of our street led up through the engineering building. And the engineering building at CU is an interesting building because it has this big underpass under it, where like the building is on like stilts.
Yes.
And you walk under it, and some of it is like there's building over you, and sometimes there's like a big hole. But there's this part as you're walking under it where light breaks through onto this little patch of trees.
Yes.
And every time I walked through there, I would do the Malick thing with my eyes, where as I'm moving, I moved my head up and saw light break through the trees and saw dust play through the light. And I would look at that and have this profound little moment of transcendence, and it would kind of make my day, whether I was going to or from. And I would do that every time. And it took me forever to realize why I do that, and it's because of this movie specifically, and the way he photographs different kinds of spaces. Like there's the stuff with Sean Penn in this movie where he is in these very sterile corporate spaces, and he does that. And there are these parts where it's just in the little neighborhood in the 1950s where the children do that. And it is profound in either case. And a lot of this rewiring happened to me before I ever opened my heart really to the movie or to Malick himself. But I will always come back to The Tree of Life, even if, again, I think critically I would make the argument for other films being his quote-unquote best. But this is my favorite. The Tree of Life tells the story of a family in the 1950s. It follows one boy in the family. They have 3 children. Specifically, the parents are played by Brad Pitt and Jessica Chastain. This was her film debut, essentially, and she is so tremendous in it. I also think it's Brad Pitt's best performance, easily, and I love Brad Pitt. I think he's a tremendous actor. And it sort of breaks with time a little bit early on, where you start with the family a little further on along the road, and they get a note that their son has died in probably Vietnam. And one of the sons, not the son that we follow for the majority of the film, the younger brother. And then, as we're kind of processing this grief, Malick flashes us all the way back and has a 20 to 30 minute sequence that is the origin of life in the universe. It's sort of like his version of Disney's Fantasia, the Rite of Spring segment, but made with a very different, kind of style. And I think it is one of the most amazing things you'll ever see in a film. And then once that sequence is over and we trace through the dinosaurs all the way up to today, we come back to the birth of the child we follow through the movie and how he kind of grows up until he gets to this one age, like he's 10 years old. And the rest of the movie is mostly at that age over one summer as his father is kind of falling into depression, and he himself is starting to rebel in different ways and awakening to certain instincts. And there are very, very few films, maybe none, that I feel like reflect some of my own life experiences more than this. I see my father in the Brad Pitt character. I see my brother in the little brother character. I see myself in the main character. Roger Ebert loved this movie, and Roger Ebert said when he reviewed this that if he had the skill of a Terrence Malick and ever made a movie, it would look a lot like The Tree of Life. And I think kind of the same thing, even though I'm a different age than those people. Mine would not be set in the 1950s as I'm growing up. But so many of the experiences here are so universal and so powerful and so palpable to me. And I love the visuals of this film. I think there is so much substance to the way this camera moves through the world. I love Malick's use of music in this film. Some of the choral and classical pieces he uses, as well as some modern orchestral pieces like the Funeral Canticle that opens the film and is there at some other points. It is majestic. This is a film that, I have wrestled with in some ways because you could call it a religious film, because I do think there are some clear Christian themes to it. I think of it more and more every time I see it as a spiritual film, because I think Malick's vision of spirituality is much more detached from a religious dogma than you might think watching just this film. It is about, I think, higher powers and other things, but not as strictly as like a Christ figure or something like that. Like many of his films, The Tree of Life does play like a long prayer or meditation, an internal meditation, and does have, I think, these calls to a godlike figure. But I think it is more universal, as I said, than any particular dogma. And it is a film that I have grown with even in periods of, when I kind of considered myself more atheistic. This is a film that still spoke to me and speaks to me stronger every time I see it. For a long time, I had only seen it the 2 times. And then about 2 years ago, I finally watched it a 3rd time. It was a movie I had trouble going back to again after my dad died. But I went back to it for that 3rd viewing and loved it even more. And I was a little scared because I was wondering, I'd only seen it twice, and one time I hated it, one time I loved it. Where am I going to break on it? And I still find it so, so powerful. I love this director. I love his work. It speaks so powerfully to me. But if I had to pick one film that speaks to me the most powerfully, it is The Tree of Life. It is a fairly recent film, 2011, but I do think it transcends its time. And I do think by the end of this decade, nothing else will quite have touched it for me. So that's my number 7 movie.
I really love what you were saying about particularly for movies, style and substance are often the exact same thing.
Yes.
It's like when I was talking about Ghost in the Shell, that Ghost in the Shell is a story told in its aesthetic. Like, I think that is, movies are, like, inherently, they tell their stories visually and they have to.
Yes.
You know? So it is, like, the aesthetic is the story of a movie in so many ways. And I do get really frustrated because that is a critique that has been leveled at Ghost in the Shell by people I know, that it's like, oh, it's just kind of a fun movie. There's not really much there. It's like, you just haven't been paying attention to what is there, because when there's not someone talking, you've just been spacing out and you're not paying attention to, like for Tree of Life, how the camera is moving, or you're not paying attention to what the music is saying at this moment, or you're not paying attention to what this, like, glance the actor is doing, what that is saying in this moment.
And it's, with Terrence Malick, what I always come back to is my calling cry these days is engage with it. I don't care if you like it, but you have to engage with it. And when people just dismiss, especially with Malick's recent films, which, look, they are really experimental and really out on a limb, and I get why people don't like them, I don't get the just sheer instinct to dismiss. Like, oh, he spins his camera a lot. Well, what do you think that means? Because I can tell you, I think it means a whole lot of different things. But just dismissing it and saying it's pure style, it's not. There's so much imbued in these, and that is a technique he has been developing for so many years. Matt Zoller cites, who took over Roger Ebert's website, when he wrote about Night of Cups last year, one of Malick's recent films. He talked about that very few American directors go out and consciously try to make a masterpiece anymore. Like, I'm going to break the boundaries. I'm going to keep doing my thing. Terrence Malick it's him, Martin Scorsese, and David Lynch are the last three standing from the American Renaissance of the 1970s. And those three are still making their stuff like the way they always have, in that they are still pushing themselves and their boundaries. And that's kind of it. And David Lynch, we thought we'd lost.
Yeah, exactly.
Because he hadn't directed anything since 2006.
But he was just biding his time.
Just biding his time.
And it's amazing.
But no, I think, and I have two of those three directors on this list, and there's a reason for that. And yeah, The Tree of Life, definitely on here for me, and a perfect example of what I mean about that overlap of style and substance, not a separation.
Yes. I think that is also a good segue into my number 6 movie, which is also a movie that if you do not try to engage it, you will just bounce right the fuck off. My number 6 is 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah, which is, if you like, probably the best part about our old podcast. If you remember, this is the first movie that was on my list. That was on my old list. And the podcast, I think it's episode 2 we did, because it was in my top 5. About half of that podcast is just us talking about 2001: A Space Odyssey, because you had seen it like 2 nights earlier.
Yeah, so, I had. That's, yeah.
it's an interesting movie. So
it is.
I'm going to read my little blurb here. Most movies have stories. 2001: A Space Odyssey is not like most movies. Most movies have characters. 2001: A Space Odyssey is not like most movies. Most movies make some kind of sense. 2001: A Space Odyssey is not like most movies. Watching 2001: A Space Odyssey is not like watching a movie. It's like being submerged in ice-cold water with your face in the sun. 2001: A Space Odyssey is not like most movies, but it does have a story. It's about the journey of humanity, from bone clubs to orbital weapons platforms, from picking lice to walking on the moon. It is about evolution, what we have been and what we one day may become. 2001: A Space Odyssey is not like most movies, but it does have characters. They are like people. One of them is a machine, but he's also like a person. Some of them are chimpanzees, but they are also like people. One of them is an ominous towering obelisk, faceless and unknowable. That one is the most like a person, at least to me. 2001: A Space Odyssey is not like most movies, but on the right day, when you stare into the heart of the sun, it makes all the sense in the world.
I like that a lot.
Yeah. 2001: A Space Odyssey is a trip of a fucking movie. Yeah, it's something where we were talking about with, like, movies are a visual medium. They tell their stories visually. The reason why I framed this way is that I feel like most people kind of, and like myself, had the reaction the first time you watched 2001: A Space Odyssey of like, was there a story in this movie? Like, who were the characters? Like, everyone latches onto the Hal section in the middle, because Hal is like the easiest thing to latch onto, because he's an AI gone rogue, and we have had, since 2001: A Space Odyssey, a whole lot of AIs gone rogue in fiction, right? So it's a very easy, like, it's the section that has the most amount of dialogue that you can latch onto the easiest. But it's also, I think, if you are just latching onto that part of the movie, it is very hard to tell what the fuck that has to do with the chimpanzees at the beginning, what that has to do with all the people on the moon, and what that has to do with Dave getting shot into, like, fuck off, like, whatever, LSD land, and ending up in, like, a bare white room as he ages over the course of 1 minute and then turns into a giant baby, right? Like, if you're only latching on to Hal, it is very hard to figure out what the story of that movie is. Who are the characters in that movie? What the fuck is going on? But if you really critically engage with the movie, it is telling you everything you need to know in every single frame, right? It is a movie, like I say, about evolution. It is a movie that is exploring, like, what is humanity and where might humanity go in the future? Like, what is our course through life? And we started as these apes, and as like in Planet of the Apes, we started as chimpanzees, and we started as little hairy creatures that walked on all fours and climbed up in trees to hide from tigers, and now we have these giant cities and are, making a really great effort at just completely fucking ourselves over. And what might happen next. And it is from a period of history that was much more optimistic in a lot of ways about science fiction, where it is called 2001, A Space Odyssey. We are in 2017. We are nowhere fucking close to going to Jupiter, my friend. We are not even close to going to Mars.
We're not very close to going to the moon again.
No, yeah, we're pretty close to just dying, all of us on the planet. So
Yeah.
we've that's kind of the future we've selected for ourselves in an unfortunate way. But there's something so like it. While 2001: A Space Odyssey is a very ominous movie, in so many ways that it uses that great classical music and this incredible image of this black monolith that just sits there and you just stare at it, not being able to understand what is this like purely alien artifact. What does it mean? What is it doing here? And I don't think like the deeper answers of those questions do not exist in the movie because they can't exist in the movie. Is one of the great things about 2001: A Space Odyssey as a piece of science fiction is that the alien presence in 2001: A Space Odyssey is not a guy in a suit. It is something that is completely alien that we have utterly no reference point for, which is how it would most likely be if we ever do encounter another alien species, intelligent alien species somewhere in the universe. But 2001: A Space Odyssey, while it has all those ominous elements, and it is a like unsettling and very terrifying movie in moments, it does have this weirdly optimistic outlook by its conclusion that there is something beyond what we are now, and it is in some ways it's very similar to Ghost in the Shell in that way, as though its perspective I think is very different on where that is. Where Ghost in the Shell I think is more in the immediate future, and 2001: A Space Odyssey is very far-reaching and thinking like, if we are able to rise out of this sort of cesspool we have built for ourselves, there is a potential for our species, hopefully, at some point in this future. And I love that message, and I will love that image of this this star child, this new entity that has been born at the conclusion of the movie. And the fact that that story is told so powerfully, it has to be told in this abstract, weird visual format, because I've read the book, and the book is fine, but there's something about the engagement and absorbment of yourself into the movie that if you really give yourself to it, it is telling you things and is telling you a story that can't be told in a more conventional format, that you can't read in a book. It can't be accessed just through words. It has to be accessed more sort of almost primitively right into your brain, and you just have to absorb it through your eyes and through your kind of heart. And that's something that few movies are able to sort of accomplish, that most movies don't even try to do, and many of the movies that do try to do fail at it. But 2001: A Space Odyssey has, again, as long as you are have your art open and you are willing to give yourself to it, it has a weird access into something really deep inside of you that scares me, but also makes me kind of hopeful.
I think we're starting to see a little bit of the definitions of our two lists.
Yeah.
Because I think your lists are going for at least the way you're framing them, somewhat big philosophical things and sure, explorations. Yeah. And I really, and you'll see through my whole list, I very much favor extremely small scale stories of just people. And, here's my thoughts on 2001. And here's an example of how you can talk about a film without just critically dismissing it, is that 2001 is not one of my 10 favorite films, sure, but I respect it immensely. I find myself a little cold to it, but I think its craft is out of this world. I think what Kubrick had the balls to try to pull off in this thing is amazing, and I completely agree with you that if you do critically engage with it, there is so much there, even if it won't become one of your favorite things. Yeah. Because I think for a movie like 2001 to exist, it has to feel alienating to some people, right?
Oh, yeah.
It cannot be everything for all people. And I like Kubrick movies like The Shining maybe a little bit more, speak to me a little bit more.
Right.
But I do think 2001 is, and maybe one day I'll watch it again, and this time will be the one where it really like hits me very, very hard. But my favorite stretch of it is easily the last stretch with all the Star Child business and everything, because that's some good filmmaking.
Yes.
But no, everything about it. I mean, it is an iconic movie for a reason, and I think one of the most interesting things about it actually is that a movie that weird has broken into the mainstream that hard over the last 50, 60 years, that it is very much just a part of culture, and it is just ingrained in culture, even though I think it is a movie that
is so inaccessible.
And certainly would never be made today.
Yeah,
because the way people like Terrence Malick and David Lynch can get away with it today is their stuff doesn't cost that much. Mm-hmm. This was a big budget movie in its time. You know?
It has some of the most impressive effects of any movie I've ever seen.
Kubrick wouldn't, and that's the thing, Kubrick wouldn't be able to do the things he did today because that kind of, especially in the United States, maybe if he got some of that French funding, but in the United States, just the kind of stuff that artists wanted to make in this period was so much bigger and more ambitious, and there was the money for it in this like brief 20-year period in the United States, and then that ended. But luckily people like Kubrick got to keep making their movies.
Yes.
So 2001 is a good movie.
It's a very good movie.
All right. So my number 6. We were going from the newest movie on my list to the oldest movie on my list, and this is City Lights from 1931 by the wonderful Mr. Charlie Chaplin, the tramp himself. I have to have a silent film on this list because they're wonderful. And I have to have a Chaplin film on this list because he's fucking Charlie Chaplin. And this is Chaplin's best silent film. It's one of the great masterpieces of American cinema history, period. And it is also, most importantly, a profoundly funny comedy. It is a comedy. I have one comedy on my list that also runs so deep with pathos that it can be painful to watch in some ways. Now, if one is being a purist, you could argue whether or not City Lights is actually a silent film, because there is a synced soundtrack and some sound effects. There is no spoken dialogue, but 1931, sound was already the norm in American cinema, but Charlie Chaplin, very wisely, I think, did not want to jump on that bandwagon yet, and he just kept perfecting his craft, and City Lights was one of the results of this, so he did write a score for it, and there are a couple of jokes in the movie, including one where Charlie, the tramp, swallows a little whistle, and then it starts squeaking. It's one of the funniest things I've ever seen, but it's completely based around a synced sound. So I would argue it's not necessarily a traditional silent film, but neither is it a sound film. To me, it's an evolution of the silent, and a brilliant, extraordinary one. That evolution would only be continued in the 1936 film Modern Times that Chaplin directed, that has a little bit of dialogue and spoken stuff in it. But it's something I love about this, is that it's something that makes me sad when I go back to older silent films and see the cinematic mastery on display, and it's like, why did we just abandon that? I understand why we have sound, but I also feel like in some ways, you look at films like anyone making silent films in the 30s, you look at the evolutions that were going on and the boundaries being broken out of what we think of as normal silent film language, and it is just amazing to me, and this is one of those great evolutions. The filmmaking here is astounding. Chaplin had great, simple cinematography, and his staging of the various set pieces in this movie, like the boxing match near the end or the police chase in the millionaire's house, they're just straight up bravura pieces of filmmaking. They're so powerful. But I love the story in this movie. It's kind of a rambling story where there's kind of two threads. One is that Charlie Chaplin, the tramp, meets this millionaire who is drunk and trying to kill himself on a little pier, and Chaplin saves him, and they become friends, but only when the millionaire is like completely wasted drunk.
Right.
And he and the tramp are the best of friends, and then when the millionaire sobers up, he doesn't want this dirty tramp in his house. And at the same time, the tramp meets this flower girl, played by Virginia Cherrill, who, she's a blind flower girl. She sells these flowers, but she's blind, and she mistakes him for a millionaire. And he becomes very kind to her and is trying to help her get money for both to keep her house and then later to have an eye operation, because there's a little bit of speculative fiction in this movie where there's a cure for blindness. So we don't have that yet. Anyway, not quite. And these two plot threads only converge a little bit in some places, but they are both about acts of seeing. They are about how people see the tramp. The tramp isn't so much the one with the arc in this movie. I think in some ways it is kind of the flower girl and the millionaire, and that he is ultimately rejected by the millionaire, and in the final scene of the movie when the flower girl's sight has been restored, kind of re-embraced by her in an interesting way. The final film of this scene, this final scene of this film, even if you have never seen a Chaplin movie, you have seen the final scene of this film because it has the most iconic shot in American film history, which is the tramp biting his lip as it fades to black as the flower girl sees him for the first time. You have seen that image, I guarantee it. It is also one of the great endings to any movie ever, where the tramp is at his lowest point. He's been in jail for a year for a crime he did not really commit, and the flower girl now has her sight again, and every time a rich person comes into the shop, she's hoping it's the guy who helped her once upon a time. And the tramp is wandering the streets, and he is more kind of bitter and sad than we will ever see him in any other Chaplin production. And then he runs into the flower girl, and she just kind of laughs at him, pities him. She can't recognize this man who showed her such kindness. And the acting here is so extraordinary. Charlie Chaplin remains one of the 5 or 10 best actors who ever walked this earth. It's mesmerizing. And then she gives him his change and touches his hand like she'd done so many times before, and she sees him. And she says, "You?" And he nods, and she says, "You can see now?" She starts to cry. Or he says, "You can see now." She starts to cry, and she says, "Yes, I can see now." It's the last intertitle of the movie, and then the last shot of Chaplin. Absolute cinematic perfection. It is such a powerful scene. But there's also so much humor in this movie that you got to talk about. There's a musical quality to the film's humor, like the boxing scene where he goes to box to try to get some money, because silent films were often a series of kind of sketches and things like that, and this is one of those. And the way Chaplin sets up this boxing scene, it is so amazing because it's a series of little motifs, like the referee coming and getting in the way of the two boxers, Chaplin just hugging the other boxer and not letting go, all these big wind-ups, these hard punches, the tramp trying to keep the guy down, the bell, and they're all remixed and reconfigured over the course of this long fight. And every time one recurs, it builds on the last use of the motif and gets funnier and more impactful. It's such a great comedy set piece, and it's just one example of this film, but this whole film is such a culmination of Chaplin's film technique. And, you know, Chaplin was one of the first people out there with a movie camera and inventing film language. And this is an absolute master at work. And if you have never seen a silent film, if you have never seen a Charlie Chaplin film, this is probably the one I would recommend you start with. This or the 1925 film, The Gold Rush. They're all in the Criterion Collection. And then I think you can work backwards to his shorts or forward to modern times in his sound films. If you have not seen The Great Dictator from 1940, it's a little relevant right now. A little bit. But you should see all of these movies. But I do think City Lights is maybe the best starting place. And there is the quality that, as I say, I think it's the best one. So you could say maybe you want to build up to it. But it's so accessible. It is so good. If so many people are so prejudiced against black and white films and silent films, just like on principle for some reason. But if you just open yourself up and watch it, it's 85 minutes. You will love it. And a whole new world will be opened up to you. I guarantee it. It's so great. City Lights. I will also say this. It is the last American film on my list, so I guess I'm calling it my favorite American movie.
Awesome.
So that's City Lights by Charlie Chaplin.
Fine choice.
What's your number 5, Sean?
My number 5 is my representative Western. It is the successor in so many ways to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It is Once Upon a Time in the West, which is the second to last Western that Sergio Leone made. The last one was a movie that is supposed to be titled Once Upon a Time in the Revolution. It has the great and utterly inexplicable American localized title, Duck You Suckers, which is, I have no explanation for why they
I didn't know
called it
those were the same movie.
Those are the same movie.
Okay.
Yes, but Once Upon a Time in the West is my favorite Leone movie. It's my favorite Western. I think it's just an incredible piece of filmmaking that has, because it was such a late Western, it has a, insight into the entire genre that is utterly remarkable to me and is one of my favorite sort of film genres and sort of one of my favorite sort of subject matters if you take the Western and could kind of put it side by side with samurai movies, which you can do in a lot of ways. It's obviously one of my big sort of passions, and I think this movie has incredible insight into that, and it does it through, as with its sort of title would suggest, an almost sort of fairy tale perspective on archetype and how to position these characters and tell its larger story. So I'm going to read my little blurb that's a bit longer than the other ones have been. Once upon a time, there was a girl who wanted to start a new life. She did it the only way in those days that girls could. She got married. So she packed her bags and moved out west beyond the edge of civilization to live with her new husband. And when she arrived, she discovered that this new life, this new opportunity, was more dangerous than she realized. Her husband had been killed by a bad man named Frank. Frank was wild. Frank was violent. Frank was the West unfettered and raging. She met another bad man who, when anyone asked his name, simply played his harmonica. The man with the harmonica wanted to kill Frank, and he needed the girl's help. He had simply appeared one day in the passing of a monster. His mouth was always cocked with a grin like he was laughing at the world, but his eyes were cold with a hate which ran deeper than the earth. She met a third man. He was named Cheyenne. Cheyenne wasn't a bad man, a bit rough around the edges perhaps, but he always did what he felt was right. Cheyenne was like Robin Hood, a noble outlaw, a dying breed. Once upon a time, a monster tore across the countryside, consuming everything in its path. The people swarmed around the monster because it left the detritus of the world in its wake. Diamonds fell from the monster's hide, food dropped from its open mouth, and water sprang from the dirt it trampled. One day that monster came to the girl's town. The people were scared at first. They knew the monster would destroy the lives that they had built. They'd heard how it would enslave them. But they lived short, violent lives, killing each other for scraps of food. Some, like Frank, even killed for the pleasure of it because no one could stop him in this wide, empty land. So when the people saw the wealth dropping from the monster, they took it. They used that wealth to build new, better homes than the ones the monster had crushed. They took the monster's food, not caring for the livestock that the monster had slaughtered. The people found themselves enslaved to the monster's wealth, and some followed it as it went on its journey further west. The girl went with it. The three men did not. They were afraid, because before they were the monsters. Now they were simply men. The girl went out and fed the monster. She lived happily ever after. So that's my fairy tale telling of basically the plot of Once Upon a Time in the West. Obviously, the actual movie is not as abstract as that, but I think the ways it expresses its themes and positions its characters and positions the train, which is the monster that comes in and sweeps away the West, has that fairy tale quality, that it expresses all those ideas, but expresses it in the the purest version of those tropes that any Western could have. Because again, it was one of Leone's last Western movies. Like, Leone was one of the latter era Western makers, or Western filmmakers in the golden era of the Western, starting from kind of the 30s to the late 60s. And so it has all of this history, and Leone, obviously the director of the Dollars trilogy, and most famously probably The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, has a particular insight into that. But Once Upon a Time in the West is not as big and sprawling as The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is. It is a long movie. It's 2 hours and 45 minutes or something like that. But it just breezes right by because it has such a remarkable sense of pace. It has maybe my favorite opening scene of any movie ever, that people would maybe have seen or heard of this scene because it's kind of famous, of these three bandits come to a train station, and it kind of like they find the guy who's running the train station. They don't buy tickets. They're outlaws, so they just shove him into a closet basically and wait for the train. And they wait for the train for 5 minutes, and there's no music playing. This is before the fantastic Morricone score starts up. And they're all just waiting for the train while this wind wheel is blowing in the wind and making these creaking sounds. And one guy is leaning on this post kind of to himself as the post creaks and is listening to the wheel. There's one guy standing under a roof that starts dripping on him. So he puts his hat on and the water drips onto the hat and it makes this sort of beat. And then the third guy, who's the best, is sitting on a bench and a fly is flying around him, and he ends up trapping the fly in his gun barrel and shaking it so he can listen to it. And you're just sitting with these three bandits waiting for this train to arrive at the station for about 5 minutes. Nothing happens. The credits just very quietly are coming up and telling you this is a movie directed by Sergio Leone, the screenplay by Sergio Leone, blah, 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 blah. Here's all the actors. And you're just watching them. And then the train comes, and they all get up, and they're ready, and you see they're reaching for their guns, and the train is there, and you know they're waiting for someone, and nobody gets off, and the train starts leaving, and they kind of look confused and start turning around to leave, and then all of a sudden they hear a harmonica playing. And then they turn around, and then Charles Bronson, who plays the main character, or kind of the main character is probably the female lead, but he's sort of the male lead of the movie. He's standing there playing his harmonica, just appearing out of nowhere. And that sort of quality of this, it does not take place in a fantasy world, but it feels like it almost does. Because the character of the man with the harmonica, who's sort of, the successor to the man with no name for the Dollars trilogy, has this capacity of just appearing out of nowhere, of sliding into frame in like a ghost-like fashion. He's just there in scenes waiting for people. At the end of the movie, when he's finally going to be able to complete his quest of revenge against Frank, who's just murderous outlaw, who's played by Henry Fonda, cast against type, because Henry Fonda is like very traditionally was a great protagonist and hero of Western movies, and now he's the villain. But at the end of the movie, the man with the harmonica is just waiting for Frank, knowing exactly where he's going to be without like anyone being able to understand how he's able to have access to this information. And that element of these characters feel like they exist within their type and define their type in Western tropes is so powerful and has such a fascinating understanding of the genre. And it also has, I think it is Leone's best film because Leone is a fantastic filmmaker, has a fantastic sense of pacing and framing, and there are some sequences of this movie that just drop my jaw every single time I see it. It has the single greatest character introduction in the scene in the history of cinema, and it's not the one with the train. The one with the train where he plays the harmonica for the first time is fantastic, but after that scene, you spend like 30 minutes setting up the other characters in the movie, and you don't see the man with the harmonica again. So it's like a huge amount of time before you see him. And later in the movie, the female lead has entered the movie. She's arrived with a train, and she's going out to her estate to meet her husband that she doesn't realize has already been killed. And on the way, she has to stop off in this almost like Mos Eisley-esque tavern, like Star Wars actually takes a lot from Once Upon a Time in the West. And while she's in this tavern, Cheyenne comes in, and you don't realize that Cheyenne's actually kind of a good guy, and you just think he's an outlaw and bandit because he comes in with a gun, and you've heard gunshots because he's been fighting some lawmen out there in the West. And he comes into this tavern, kind of takes control of it, just steals a bottle, and he sort of has control of the room, and he starts talking to some people. And then all of a sudden, very quietly, you hear in the background a harmonica start playing, and you hear that noise. And at first, you don't know if it's supposed to be diegetic or not, because there has been that kind of theme has played in some of the other scenes as part of the non-diegetic Morricone soundtrack. But then you see that Cheyenne notices it, and you realize, oh, it's playing in the bar. And Cheyenne walks around in the bar, and he's looking around, and he sees that there's some figure cloaked in the darkness in the corner, sitting up, propped up on the bar in the back. And Cheyenne sort of cautiously approaches him, and the music is getting louder, the harmonica is getting louder, and then there's a backing track in the soundtrack that starts coming up and building, and Cheyenne sees him, and Cheyenne looks up, and he sees that there's a lantern hanging next to him that's suspended on a chain that runs down the length of the bar. So he grabs the lantern, and he heaves it back as the music builds to a crescendo, and he throws the lantern, and it slides down along the length of the chain, down the bar, and dispels the darkness that Charles Bronson is hiding in. And he's revealed there, playing his harmonica as the guitar sting comes in, bow, and he's just sitting there playing the harmonica as the lantern swings back and forth. And as it swings back and forth, you're on a close-up on Charles Bronson's eyes, and the shadows keep on coming up and then receding back and coming up and receding back. And it's the coolest fucking thing I have ever seen in a movie, and it's achieved entirely through music and visuals and just pacing in the editing. And that craft is everywhere in Once Upon a Time in the West. It has absolutely the best final gunfight in any of Leone's movies, and it's just a showdown between harmonica and Frank. It is such a pure expression of everything that is amazing about the Westerns, while also exploring the themes of the end of the West and of the trains coming in, because that's really what the plot is about, is how the train is coming in, and kind of as the train is coming in, everything needs to come to its conclusion. Like, the villain has to be killed, the hero has to have his moment, like, the West has to end in its glorious, bloody fashion as the train is sort of making it so that this sort of weird fairy tale land you've entered can't exist anymore because civilization won't allow it. And that's both a good thing on the one hand, because you don't want assholes like Frank going around and murdering people's families for money, but it's also a sad thing because you don't have the sort of freedom and unfettered lives, and you don't get to have a guy like Cheyenne that gets to run around and be this goofy, brilliant, marvelous person. That kind of guy can't live in society. And so it has that kind of bittersweet element of the West and of the fairy tale that I utterly adore. And I think it's a movie. It should not be in any way the first Western that people watch, but if you have not seen Once Upon a Time in the West, because while it's not an obscure movie, it's certainly not as famous as something like The Searchers of the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And once you've watched a lot of those other Westerns and you've seen Leone's other movies leading up to this, Once Upon a Time in the West, I think, is absolutely the purest and most effective cinematic expression of the West I've ever seen.
Nice. I have not seen this movie.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
You should give it a shot.
I should.
It's very good.
It sounds good. I like the harmonica guy. Sounds cool.
He's very cool. Charles Bronson is not an actor I have like a particular affinity for, but he brings such a different presence than Clint Eastwood, because Clint Eastwood is so grim and like, you know, he just glares at people and his mouth is just like stocked like flat middle. But Charles Bronson, there's something about his face. It always has this weird, like, small grin, no matter what's happening. And that's what adds to the mystique of the man with the harmonica. That he's not just sitting there, like, stoically. He's kind of laughing at everything happening to him because he exists above it in some weird way. He's like a Robin Goodfellow figure, but not in a literal way. It's just like in the corners of the movie, it feels like that. I love it.
All right, so for my number 5... we've been on a little tour around the world. We've gone to Poland. We've gone to France.
Yes, we've gone to India.
We've gone to India. Now we went home to America. Now my list is going to come to rest on the island nation of Japan.
My list is almost at that point as well.
And I'll just say right here, I think Japan has the richest film history of any country, especially its golden age. And we'll get there. But we're going to start with one of the probably greatest, especially for live action, Japanese director of the 1990s. And that is Takeshi Kitano, also known, especially to the people of Japan, as Beat Takeshi, a very silly guy on TV who's a very serious guy in the movies.
Yes.
And we are going to talk about his 1997 masterpiece, Hanabi.
Okay, yeah.
Now, Hanabi is sometimes called Fireworks, and I don't like it when that movie is called by the English translation.
You want it to
because
be, it's like Fireflower?
No. It should just be called Hanabi.
Okay.
But let me tell you why. Because, as you were saying, fireworks and what the Japanese call Hanabi are the same thing.
Yeah.
But to translate it actually does take a huge thing away from this movie. Because the word for fireworks in Japan, Hanabi, is composed of the word hana for flower,
yes,
and bi for fire. And that's very important because it's a huge idea at the heart of this movie. It's a symbolic thing we see across the film, which is representations of flowers and of nature and of fire and of violence. You know, be it a gunshot or a literal fire that goes off.
Right.
And the whole thesis of this movie is that the fire and the flower exist at the heart of people. It is a warring, uncomfortable relationship within the human condition. But it also argues, I think, that one is necessary for the other. It is that you do not get the transcendent without the violent, and you don't get the violent without the transcendent. Everything you need to know about the movie is there in the title. So when I do see like a poster that displays fireworks, I think it's a very thoughtless way to call that movie in another language. You know, and there should be some thought put into how we translate film titles. But anyway, let me tell you a little bit about this movie. One thing that is important to know is that Hanabi is the second movie Kitano made after a suicide attempt. In the mid-90s, he crashed his motorcycle, almost died, smashed half of his face. You will now see he has some facial disfiguration, especially he has this little eye twitch that happens and things like that. Technically, half his face was paralyzed for a while. He directed one film after that accident called Kids Return, which I highly recommend. I should say none of his movies are easily available here, except in the United States, except his most recent movies. Hanabi, for instance, there is a DVD from the 90s that is absolutely terrible and you should avoid like the plague. Otherwise, it is not available. I have you can get it imported from the United Kingdom on Blu-ray, which I have ordered, but it hasn't come yet because I had not had a recent region-free Blu-ray player until recently, or the Japanese DVD is very good. I did just learn there will be a company putting it out on Blu-ray later this year in the United States, which
awesome.
is cool. They've put out another couple of Kitano's films, and I've seen those editions, and they're very nice, so hopefully it'll be good. This movie deserves that. It's been really underserved. I've always hoped Kitano would get into the Criterion Collection, and sadly, I think a lot of 90s foreign directors have weird rights issues, and that they don't have a lot of those. So anyway, but let me tell you about Hanabi. I'm just telling you now I've told you how you can actually see it. Like I said, so this is the first film he starred in after his suicide attempt. And Hanabi is very reflexively about suicide. It is about tragedy. The story is told in a very fractured sort of way, but the basic plot is you have these two characters, one played by Takeshi Kitano, one played by an actor named Ren Osugi. They are longtime police partners. They're really good cops. Like they're almost famous around the police force because they're really good at what they do. And on one job, the Ren Osugi character gets shot on a stakeout, and he's paralyzed from the waist down. Meanwhile, the Takeshi Kitano character, he and his wife have lost a child. We don't know how, but we just know that they had a daughter who died, and his wife now has terminal cancer. So he's facing being very alone, and at the same time, his partner has gone through this horrible. He's been disabled.
Yeah.
So we kind of follow both characters through the movie. They actually have very few moments where they're together, but I would argue this is another movie that you could say it's kind of about one spirit split across two bodies. Not in the literal sense that he's doing anything like metaphysical here, but like in the cinematic language and in the themes of the film, that is very much what the movie is about, and about how these different kind of sides coexist and that there is this interesting transference between them. Over the course of the film, the Ren Osugi character turns to painting while he's in his wheelchair. This is something that Kitano himself turned to after his suicide attempt. He became a pointillist painter, which is painting all with little dots. And I love Kitano's paintings. If you've ever seen them, he had an exhibit in France in the last 10 years or so, and there's a catalog out of that, so you can see a lot of those images, and they're beautiful. You can also see a lot of those in this movie, because every painting in this film and almost every frame has one of them in them, whether just in a random setting, like when they're in a bar, or it's something the Ren Osugi character is painting himself. All of those were done by Kitano, so his hands are in the film. And again, it's an interesting bodily transference, because the Kitano character is not the person doing the painting, and I find that fascinating.
Right.
But the Kitano character, meanwhile, he stops being a cop because he went and found the guy who shot his partner and brutally murdered him, and you're not supposed to do that in Japan. In Japan, there are consequences when cops kill people.
Yes.
Even people who deserve it. There's consequences for it, let alone if you did it to an innocent person.
Yeah.
So Japan's a very different country. They have things like the rule of law. Anyway, but yes, so the Kitano character, he's no longer a cop because of this, and he starts sort of working for the Yakuza, although I will stress, I hate it when people say this is a Yakuza movie. It's not fucking Yakuza movie. Just because your movie has Yakuza in it, it's not a Yakuza movie. For the love of with that's actually a genre with like a code in it, you know? And Kitano, I would argue, has only made 2 of those. But people call all his movies, they're not Yakuza movies. Anyway, he kind of starts working for these Yakuza, and he's got this big debt because he's trying to pay his wife's medical bills. And finally, he just breaks bad and decides the way to get money is he decides to rob a bank. And it's, I'm not going to spoil it. The sequence, the whole bank robbery, what he does to get there, utterly fantastic. The actual bank robbery is the simplest, yet one of the most effective of that kind of scene you will ever see in your life. And the second half of the film is he and his sick wife basically go on this little countryside tour. They go to Kyoto, they go to Mount Fuji, they kind of go around Japan, and they wind up on a beach somewhere, and they make a choice. And I won't say any more than that. But it is an unspeakably beautiful movie. There is a story going on, but it is not about a linear narrative progression. It is about these characters living in these moments and these kind of spiritual and transcendental awakenings they have. It is a beautiful, beautiful movie visually. Gorgeous, gorgeous imagery. And I've only seen this on DVD, and it speaks that strongly. I'd love to see a print of it someday. I hope this Blu-ray from the UK is good. But it also has a score by Joe Hisaishi, who is one of 2 people who appear twice on my list.
There you go.
And we'll talk about Joe Hisaishi later. He is, I think...
I wonder under what context that will be.
I think Joe Hisaishi is the greatest film composer who has ever done the art. He is an utterly brilliant person, and his music is fantastic. He's done everything by Hayao Miyazaki, and up until the 2002 film Dolls, he scored most of Takeshi Kitano's films. This is one of his masterpieces. This movie came out the same year as Princess Mononoke, and those are probably, to me, Hisaishi's 2 best film scores. The Hanabi score is incredible. Large stretches of Hanabi are completely free of dialogue. The Kitano character does not say anything until like 40 minutes into the movie, and even then he has very few lines throughout. So the score does so much for the movie, but it's not big. It's very gentle in how it augments the film, but it is such a beautiful meeting of filmmaker and of composer. It is a very violent movie in parts, although you'll see it's got Kitano's style where he tends to, at least in this period of his career, he cuts around the violence in very fractured ways that actually, I think, make it seem more brutal than it maybe even is.
Yeah.
But you'll have these moments of incredible violence next to moments of transcendence, is the word I keep coming back to, because it is about being at one with the landscape and having these feelings of like something bigger, and like this sense of like kind of internal, almost not happiness but calm that comes from it. It's a very funny movie in some parts, a very warm movie. It is so many things. I think it is one of the most remarkable films of the 90s of all time. It is absolutely incredible. Thank God it's actually coming out on a available home video edition in the United States, because you need to see this movie. I think Kitano's films of the 90s are essential. I like his films past the 90s as well, but some of them are less essential, I think. This was his 7th movie, and everything he made in the 90s was just incredible, but I do think this is his masterpiece, and one of my favorite Japanese films, which makes it one of my favorite films, period.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, because I've seen most of Kitano's movies from that era as well, and this is the one I would pick, because it does just have this brutally human quality to it, because it is, as you said, it's a movie that, like, it has a plot, but it is much more about sitting with these characters as they deal with their emotions and try to move forward in life, and it's an intense movie.
It is. My other favorite Kitano film, if you're interested, also completely unavailable here, is called A Scene at the Sea. Have you seen that one, Sean?
No, I think that's one of the ones I haven't.
Okay, that's one of the ones he's not in, but he directed. It's the first movie he edited, and his editorial style is really important. He edits his own movies. And that's also the first one he did with Hisaishi, and it's about a deaf couple, and the man decides he wants to become a surfer. And I love that movie to death. If you know what, import it from anywhere. You do not need subtitles to enjoy that movie. There is some dialogue in it, but it is incidental and does not matter. It's like a silent film. You need the visuals, you need the music, and you're good to go. And A Scene at the Sea, an utter masterpiece. It is also on Blu-ray in the UK, and that's coming for me in that same order, and I would love to see it. Those are my 2 favorite films of his. But they're all worthwhile. And he actually has a film coming out this October, like on my birthday, although it's in Japan, so I'm not going to see it anytime soon, which is the 3rd film in his Outrage series. Those are his only real Yakuza movies, and I love them. The second one is so good, and I'm so glad he's doing a 3rd. But
I did not know he was doing a 3rd, because it's been a while since Beyond Outrage. So.
Yeah, it's called... what's it called?
Outrage Coda.
Yeah. So Outrage Beyond, and then Outrage Coda. But anyway, Kitano, love him. Hanabi, so good. That's my number 5 film.
Awesome.
And our first step into the world of Japanese cinema.
Yes. We'll have to step out for a second.
Okay.
My number 4 movie is an American movie. My number 4, this is the another movie that was on my old list. It is King Kong.
How could you not have King Kong, especially for you?
Yes, there's no way not to have King Kong. King Kong... I mean, it almost feels pointless to even really talk about it, because it's also, like, King Kong is the oldest movie on my list as well, from 1933. I'm going to go ahead and read my little thing I wrote here. At the end of King Kong, spoilers, the world's most famous ape dies his tragic death.
No.
'Twas beauty, muses Carl Denham, that killed the beast. Movies are magic. They show us peoples and places and things that do not exist. They are windows into other worlds and other imaginations. They are windows into dreams. Since 1933, no movie has succeeded King Kong in imagination. No other such window has ever been so clear, because the only way to convince the audience that Kong has died is to first prove that he lived, and he was alive. Vivified by such craft and thoughtfulness, King Kong lived. He fought, he bled, he roared, and most tragically, he loved. Yes, King Kong lived and still lives on the other side of that window. Every time I watch the movie, I feel that this time just may be the time he notices the window, the time he climbs out of it, because he is just as alive as you and me, and one day he will realize that.
What else can you say about King Kong other than it's a good fucking movie? Like, it just embodies the idea of it's a good movie. It's
a good movie that also is... We've talked about this concept a lot on this podcast, of that when any piece of art has to break the mold and invent itself because its category, its genre, whatever it is, does not exist yet, it has this power and this energy and this creativity to it that persists throughout all of history, even when, everything pulls from King Kong. Everything, like, whether it's special effects work or camera techniques or like sets, whatever, everything pulls from King Kong. Like, the entire history of American cinema after King Kong is created by King Kong. Like, special effects movies, like fucking blockbusters, everything. It goes back to King Kong, and yet, like what I say here, I don't think any movie has ever succeeded King Kong in imagination, because it had to invent everything. The sheer creativity in the craft of building this movie is utterly unbelievable to me. I still don't fully understand how the fuck they did it in 1933, because some of the effects and some of what they achieved with the effects of convincing you that King Kong is a character by moving a doll on a screen one frame at a time is utterly unbelievable. I mean, there are like few fight scenes in the entire history of cinema that, in my experience, that are as riveting and engaging and as powerful as watching King Kong fight the dinosaur, the T-Rex, in the middle of King Kong. Because I rewatched this movie like 2 months ago and I had my breath held that entire sequence. It's terrifying, it's shocking, it's amazing, it's exciting, it's just a brilliant bit of filmmaking, and the whole thing, again, is Willis O'Brien moving two dolls one frame at a time while they're like using this like projection for Fay Ray like on the tree. And that's it. Like that's how they made that whole movie. That's how they made that whole scene. And you have everything of once they enter Skull Island and all the backgrounds become matte paintings and weird sound stages and just strange sound effects as stegosauruses stalk them. It creates such a brilliant sense of the otherworldly and of moving into this place of pure imagination and pure dream like creativity that it just inspires a childlike wonder in me every single time I watch this movie, and I've watched this movie probably upwards of a dozen times at this point.
It's so good. You know, you have a King Kong poster on your wall where we record
right
this
here.
podcast. So, like 90% of the time while we're recording this, I'm looking at King Kong. Is that an Italian poster? Regia, M. Cooper, and E. Schoedsack?
Who knows? It's a great poster, though.
It's a great poster. Anyway, so I'm always looking at this King Kong poster. Love them. I got to see this at the Draft House. They did a theatrical screening of it a couple years ago, and this movie should be like shown in theaters like mandatory every 6 months or something, because it does belong on the big screen.
Yes.
It is even though our screens today are not shaped the same, it belongs up there because it is like you want to just melt into the world, and this movie has been very well cared for.
Yes.
It looks beautiful in modern restorations, which is great because not all movies of this era do. But it's so good. It holds up as well as it ever has. I even love the cheesiness of some scenes in it, like say I think I love you.
Yeah,
that's one of my favorite like romance lines ever. Is the way the Fay Ray and Robert Armstrong characters kind of fall into each other there. I love it so much. But yeah, it's what I honestly I'm at a point where I don't know what you could say about King Kong, other than one thing to consider is the sheer number of directors of so many generations who will say I make movies because of King Kong. It's like we talk about how Star Wars had this chemical effect on kids at the time. I don't think that even touches the effect King Kong has had over the ages.
Yeah.
If you look at a guy like Peter Jackson, for instance, he wasn't born in 1933.
No.
He saw it on New Zealand TV, and I didn't even know they had TVs down there.
I think it was a recent development when Jackson was a kid.
Yeah, the sheep-powered.
Exactly, yes.
Anything else to say about King Kong?
If you haven't seen King Kong, go watch it. Like, don't just have that movie be a part of, like, you've seen clips of it on TV and weird things because it's so heavily referenced. There are great ways to watch that movie, like the Blu-ray collection, everything, fantastic.
Oh, Warner Brothers.
Watch that movie.
Warner Brothers has always treated it well. The DVD or Blu-ray both looks great, and the bonus features are out of this world.
Yes, if you are interested in the craft of filmmaking at all, and particularly the special effects side of it, the special features that they have done for King Kong are necessary viewing.
Yes. All right, my number 4 film. We're going to go back to the year 1954. And we're going to be there for 2 movies of mine, because 1954 is a big year in Japanese cinema, and I'm pretty sure you're going to have one too.
Probably.
Just guessing.
I'm guessing.
I think I know you're going to have at least 1 or 2. But anyway, you were talking about with King Kong, like when a movie has to like invent itself raw, that's an amazing thing.
Yeah.
I think this is an example of that, and it is from the great Akira Kurosawa, Seven Samurai.
That might appear on my list at some point. Who knows?
Okay, I'm pretty sure it will. Seven Samurai is as influential a movie as exists. Every fucking bit as much as a Citizen Kane. I'd argue maybe even more so.
Yeah.
And yet its greatness to me is defined in how completely it still feels fresh, no matter when or how many times you see it. It is just that good at what it does, that accomplished, that inspired in everything it attempts. This is essentially the birth of the modern action movie in so many tropes and so many places. And yet, anything this movie attempts pretty much, it has never been topped at those things. It is still so enjoyable and feels so modern and just utterly perfectly accomplished in what it does. It is a 3.5-hour movie. It's 207 minutes. And every time I take it off the shelf and think about watching it, I'm a little daunted by that.
Right.
And then I start watching it, I'm like, oh, right. this movie feels shorter than most movies because it kind of just flies by. It needs every minute. It has economy to every minute. It is paced so perfectly. It's a movie full of names that are so important to Japanese cinema. Mr. Kurosawa himself.
Yep.
The cinematographer on this is Asakazu Nakai, who is one of the great Japanese cinematographers. He worked a lot with Kurosawa, one of his regular DPs. Kazuo Miyagawa is a maybe more famous name who we'll hear about in a little bit. But Nakai, I mean, the cinematography in Seven Samurai, especially in the last stretch when they're in the rain and the climax and stuff, what Kurosawa and this guy did with, photography on location in nature with, rain effects, with that black and white. This movie couldn't exist in color. It's too perfect in black and white. You've got Fumio Hayasaka, the composer here, who is the other name you will see twice on my list. And Fumio Hayasaka sadly died young the year after this movie came out, but this is one of his masterpieces, and I love the music to this movie. I actually think it's an underrated part of Seven Samurai is how good the music is. For the actors, you've got Toshiro Mifune.
Yes.
Amazing. You've got Takashi Shimura.
Yes.
Amazing. And a cast of thousands, practically.
Yeah.
There's so many good ones here. Recently, when I was watching this movie again for this list, I was watching Toshiro Mifune, particularly in the scene where his character is going in the river to try to catch the fish. And I thought, he had to have been an influence on Andy Serkis when he did Gollum, right?
Right.
Because, if Toshiro Mifune lived today, he would be a motion capture guy, and he would do those kind of things, because he threw himself into his performance so completely. It's like he's possessed body and soul in this movie. One thing I think is interesting to note about Seven Samurai is Kurosawa favors this very theatrical style of acting, in which the actor's entire body becomes part of the performance. And Mifune is the most emblematic of this, but look at Takashi Shimura and how he's constantly rubbing his bald head and things like that. there's so much physicality to everything. And it's actually something in film school I noticed distanced a lot of American young people from Japanese films, was oh, that's so unrealistic. And I'm well, okay, they might say that about our acting now, and it's a cultural thing. It's also part of what pisses me off about this thing in film academia where they're always Kurosawa is the most Western of all Japanese directors. And I'm fuck you, that's racist.
Yeah.
It's I could enumerate all the reasons, but I can't believe you don't get it. And the other thing is yes, Kurosawa has some Western influences. All of them did, because Hollywood was a big thing, but... Kurosawa is so indebted to Japanese culture and art in everything he did, especially those theatrical traditions in his movies. If you want to dispel that notion forever, go watch Throne of Blood, which it's based on a Shakespeare play. It's done in the style of a No performance, and quit saying he's the most Western. Fuck you guys. Anyway, but I'm getting off track because there's so many good things to talk about here. It's the other thing about Seven Samurai. It's not just the action film tropes it has, but its basic plot has been repeated and played with hundreds of times in other movies. I mean, the plot of A Bug's Life is an homage to a Seven Samurai. Not to mention things like The Magnificent Seven or things like that.
It's to the point where sometimes on this podcast I have to stop myself from describing the plot of something as it's basically kind of just the Seven Samurai.
Right.
Because you can't just say that, you need to actually describe it.
Yep. But here's what I love, is that even though it's been done so many times, Seven Samurai is so aware of how simple the premise it is built upon is. Because, basically, the first scene in the movie is the bandits coming to the village and deciding we're going to wait about 6 months to raid this village, and the villagers going, "Aw shit, we're fucked," and deciding, you know what, we're not going to take this anymore, we're going to go hire some samurai. And if that were a movie made today, it would take 45 minutes to get to that premise. I guarantee you. We would have 5 scenes with the villagers. We'd learn all about the bandits. We'd see them go rob a different village. And Kurosawa was no, just get the premise out of the way. And then the rest of the movie is building the characters and building the sense of progression and getting ready for the attack and showing us in such articulate detail every bit of the geography of this village, down to Takashi Shimura holding a map and having a count of how many people are left. And then the second half of this movie is this cascading wave of action scenes that I also think, today, a Michael Bay movie or a superhero movie or something, they would just have an hour of solid action. Kurosawa has 2 hours of up and down, where there's a big action scene and then they retreat and they calm down and they take stock of what's going on, and we see where the characters are, and then we go back into it and then we come back out of it, and it those times between them gets shorter and shorter, but he has just this great sense of pace to everything that happens, down to, we've joked before that there's this whole trend that's kind of dying now where in America we've been adapting adapting movies into part 1 and part 2.
Right, yeah.
And if you actually split Seven Samurai at the intermission and released it at 2 movies, it would work okay.
Yeah.
Because the end of part 1 is a very good climax thematically to everything that's happened up to that point. You have Takashi Shimura giving this speech about where he says, by protecting others, you save yourselves. If you think only of yourself, you'll only destroy yourself. Which is, I think, one of the key morals of this film. And it's something that when I watched it recently struck me like, boy, we need to hear that today in America as much as anyone in Japan did in 1954. It's universal. And then the second half of the movie is all this rising action. It is a perfect fucking film. Everything about it is great. It is as entertaining a movie as has ever existed, and I love it to death. And this is where I had trouble ranking things a little bit, because I want all of these last 4 movies to be my number 1 in some way.
Yeah.
But Seven Samurai, man, it is stupendous.
Yes. Well, it's very nice that you were able to talk about that, because it just so happens that my number 3 movie is a little movie called Shin no Samurai, which is Seven Samurai. So I'll get to now have my big speech about Seven Samurai, because obviously...
So you agree with me?
Yes, I agree with you. This is the third movie from my old list to reappear. So, when the battle is over, and 4 samurai, spoilers, lie in shallow graves on the hill, when the singing voices of the peasants picking their crops from the fields ring out amongst the destruction, 3 men leave the village. 2 are old, 1 is young. All are victorious, but none of them taste it. Seven Samurai presents the most distinctly bittersweet ending of any film I've seen. Perhaps that is because Seven Samurai has the firmest grasp on the complex, multitudinous kaleidoscope that is humanity. Seven Samurai is about the most human thing possible. Seven Samurai is about trying to do good in a messed up world. The Seven Samurai can't fix feudalism, they can't fix poverty, they can't fix crime, they can't fix Bushido, they can't solve the world's problems. All they can do is help one village of peasants hold out against a group of bandits for 1 season. That's it. Did the peasants deserve saving? Did the bandits deserve to die? Was the price paid worth it? Who knows? All one can do is walk away from the village, resolute that there are battles that must be fought because there are causes worth fighting for, even if it doesn't save the world, and even if the world doesn't care.
I love what you wrote there, because I was talking about the cinematics and how entertaining this movie is. It is also a film so dense and rich with big ideas, and it nails them so precisely. It is, to me, it is one of those movies that has an absolute claim on that title of greatest movie ever made. It has to be in that discussion if you're having that talk.
Yeah, because I've never seen another movie, I think, that presents this sense of, the intractability of society, of, there's so many factors at play that Seven Samurai keeps on pulling back all these layers of. At first it starts with this very basic simple premise that of course everyone's going to get off on, bandits are assholes, these poor downtrodden peasants should be protected, and the samurai should be the ones to do it. And the deeper you go into the movie, the more and more it complicates this idea of the bandits are not just bandits, they probably were samurai before, and then their sort of dynasty was destroyed by the Tokugawa shogunate and dispelled, and so they had no money, nowhere to go, so what else are they going to do? How are they going to survive? And the samurai themselves are killers, and the samurai have perpetuated states of warfare and battle between the different factions within the shogunate and before the shogunate existed, that have created this whole scenario and that have perpetuated a system of feudalism that keeps the peasants down. And then the peasants themselves are not totally innocent, and that's where the great scene where Kikuchiyo finally sort of snaps in the middle of the movie, and he runs out and he grabs all this stuff, this gear that the peasants have been hoarding and haven't been sharing with the samurai because they are hoarders, because they have murdered poor, lone, starving, wounded samurai when they have been on their own and removed from their larger unit, and dragged them into basically the woods and fucking killed them and stole everything they had and have been hiding them away just in case. And so Kikuchiyo goes and finds all these hordes, because he used to be a peasant, and drags them all out and has this big, dramatic, emotional speech that is so heartbreaking, where he's basically he tears down the peasants and says they're cowards, they're monsters, they're murderers too, they're not worth saving, but you know what, the reason why they're not is because of you fuckers, because of you, the samurai, because of all of this, because of society has put us in this position where there is no right answer, there is no easy solution, there is no way to just, like I said, fix society, there's no way to just fix the world. And at the end of the day, you just have to sort of plant your feet on the firmest soil you can find and decide that that's the battle you're going to fight. And it's probably the right choice to fight for the peasants, even if you're not solving the larger picture, and even if you're maybe doing an evil by killing those bandits. It's the fight that you need to fight. And that ending of Seven Samurai, every time I've watched this movie, and I watch it once every 2 or 3 years, because I can't watch it again in quick succession because it's such a heavy movie that sits with me, that ending evolves for me every single time I see it. And there's so many layers, I feel, to what it is saying and what I see in myself reflected in it, that it's, like you say, it's a movie that is of the utmost caliber in terms of filmmaking craft, but it is also an incredible piece of thematic storytelling that has a very, very remarkably strong character foundation.
And we're in this era that, I'm going to be talking about for my next 2 films as well, the kind of most solidified golden age of Japanese cinema that I would say starts in the 1930s, but especially late 40s and throughout the 50s is at its peak, where you have filmmakers like Kurosawa and some other filmmakers I'm going to talk about, you might talk about, who were just cranking out masterpieces every year.
Yeah.
And that Kurosawa, you had people dreaming this big, where Kurosawa was just like, I'm going to make a 3.5-hour samurai movie, and it's going to change the world. And it feels like it's made with that purpose on some level, Like, there was an audacity to the films being made in this day and age in Japan that was incredible, and Seven Samurai is so emblematic of those things. Yeah. There's another one that I think both of us have gotten to see on the big screen.
Yes.
So belongs there. If you ever have the chance, it's deserving.
Yes. Hopefully they give you the intermission so you go into the bathroom halfway through.
Yes.
It's a long movie.
The intermission should be observed because it's also a pacing thing. It's
Yeah.
supposed to be there. Love this movie to death. The Criterion edition of this film is one of my favorites. It's the first Criterion I ever bought. It's spine number 2 in the collection.
There you go.
And it's a Blu-ray that has a giant book with it. It's got 2 discs. It's got the movie. It's got 2 versions of the soundtrack, 2 commentaries, like 7 hours of bonus features. It's a really cool little film school in a box thing, and it should be on every shelf.
Yeah, absolutely.
That kind of movie.
Yeah.
All right. So that was your number 3.
Yep.
I got to do my number 3. And my number 3 is also from 1954. It's by Kenji Mizoguchi, one of the great Japanese directors, and this is Sancho the Byleth, or Sancho Dayu. Sancho the Byleth is a movie I saw my first year of film school, my first semester of film school. My professor showed it to us to illustrate the concept of mise-en-scène, and I think it's a great thing to show for mise-en-scène because this film is as complete an evocation of that idea as there could be in how the sets, the costumes, the performances, the narrative style, the pace, even the music and elements of the photography are all placing you firmly in the world of what the movie itself calls Japan's Dark Ages, where pain and suffering kind of ruled the land. And some movies I've talked about on this list and will talk about, I saw and I kind of bounced off them. Sancho the Byleth broke me in that I got to the last scene and was in tears and had this profound experience with. And it is probably the movie that cemented me on the idea of film school and going through this program and opening myself up to all these movies. It definitely was one of the earliest Japanese films I saw, and opening myself up to this era. And every time I come back to it, I love it more. Mizoguchi, near the end of his life, he died in 1956, so this is one of his last films, but his run in the 50s, he made 3 movies in a row. The Life of Oharu, Ugetsu, and Sancho the Byleth, all 3 in a row won the top prize at the Venice Film Festival. All 3 helped bring Japanese cinema to the West. And, people fight all the time over, well, not fight, but, kind of debate which one is the great masterpiece of Mizoguchi. I love all 3 of them. I do think it's Sancho the Byleth. I think, to tell you a little bit about this film, I think it's kind of like a fable or folk tale. And it is based on a verbal folk tale that was written down at one point, and the written novella, which Criterion has in the box with the movie, which you should buy. Mizoguchi, that's specifically what he based this on, although he expanded it a lot. And the fable, or the folk tale, is about this family. Their father is basically the governor of this area of Japan, and he decides to kind of go against. Maybe he's not the guy. He's one of the. It's a feudalistic system, and I forget who's who. But I think he's a governor. He goes against the person above him, kind of in the chain, for kind of a human rights reason, and he is banished. And so his wife and son and daughter The wife takes them to try to kind of flee, and we're not sure where they're going. Along the way, they are captured and split apart. The mother's taken to one place. The children are taken to the home of Sancho the Bailiff, who is a very cruel man who has a kind of a private mansion and a lot of slaves. They are all sold into slavery, and the children grow up. And then eventually the woman, there's two, there's Zushio and his sister, and the sister winds up sacrificing herself essentially so that Zushio can get free. In the film version, one of Mizoguchi's master strokes is having Zushio kind of, over the 10 years they're slaves, he starts to lose his humanity and forget his father's teachings. Because his father told them before they left, a man is not a human being without mercy. Even if you are hard on yourself, be merciful to others. Men are created equal. Everyone is entitled to their happiness. The whole film is about testing those ideas. And when his sister dies and Zushio gets free, Zushio kind of reawakens to his humanity. He goes to see, it's not quite the emperor, but a high-level figure in the Japanese feudal system. And he is reinstated in his father's position because they realize they did his family a great wrong. And he basically uses all his political capital to get rid of slavery from his area and free the slaves of Sancho. Doing this, he loses his position, and then he goes off to find his mother, and that's the last scene of the film. And I tell you the whole story because it's not so much the story, but how it's told, and that this is a great folk tale, and that it is not overtly moralistic in a lot of ways. It's not about getting to the end and Zushio is like, oh, I have learned X.
Right, yeah.
It is about this story where there are lessons constantly being imparted upon you. Every scene, every moment, you are learning things about humanity, about yourself, about what it means to be moral, about what it means to be human and alive, what it means to sacrifice, what it means to strive. And that's what a great fable or a great folk tale is. It's these ideas being tested, and at the end of it, you take from this story what you will. And I think every time you watch, you take new things from it. Because like all the great stories that endure through the ages, it's not one central lesson, but these lessons layered and layered on top of each other. And within that, Mizoguchi's film craft is jaw-dropping. This film was shot by Kazuo Miyagawa, the greatest of all Japanese cinematographers. He's kind of like the Japanese Greg Toland, who shot Citizen Kane, in the way he plays with contrast and particularly more than a Greg Toland ever did, on-location photography, which is outstanding and was kind of rare at this time in sound film around the world. And just the black and white photography here, I think, is unspeakably beautiful. Luckily, it exists in very good condition. A lot of Japanese film of this era does not. Even Seven Samurai is a little rough around the edges. It's beautiful. And then the score is written, once again, by Fumio Hayasaka, who we met with Seven Samurai. And it's a very traditional Japanese score in that it has all these instruments like from the time period. And it's very different than anything you've ever heard, but I love it. And it's such an exquisite part of the mise-en-scène. When I say everything is contributing to that mise-en-scène, I mean it. The acting is, I think, stunning. It is very theatrical. There's a big scene I remember, Sancho's son, who winds up, he's so horrified by what his slave-owning father does that he goes and becomes a Buddhist monk. And it's something we're saying, that this movie, I think, is very much a religious film. It is very much about sort of Buddhist ideas. Even though it does not draw a ton of attention to that, it's worth engaging with it on that level. But anyway, becomes a Buddhist monk. But before he does that, that son, realizing what has happened to these poor children, Zushio and his sister Anju, he's so mad. He, like, with his whole body, he takes this, like, gourd and he's just, like, smashing it on the ground because he can't believe what's going on. And I found it one of the most powerful things I'd ever seen in a movie. And I remember sitting in the theater in that film school class and all these other kids just laughing derisively at it. And at that point, I'm like, and I'm sure, one, most of those kids probably dropped out. And two, like, it was a thing where it's like, no, I want to do this because look at this. I've never seen anything like this, and this is such powerful acting. And especially the final scene of the movie, which is the actress Kinuyo Tanaka, who is one of the most famous actresses in Japanese history. She was in hundreds of movies and in a lot of Mizoguchi's films, and she plays the mother. And the mother is not in the movie a ton, but what she does near the end, oh my God, one of the best performances you'll ever see in anything.
Yeah.
I could talk about Sancho the Bailiff for hours. I think I've covered some of the main things. The point is, this is one of those movies in contention for me as the greatest film of all time. I think it is in that very innermost circle. It is so good. It is a movie that is here not just because I love it and have some personal connection to it, but because I think its quality is simply that high. Kenji Mizoguchi, great director. He's less known now than Kurosawa and Ozu, who are the maybe two most prominent directors of that period. But at the time, I mean, his movies, especially Ugetsu, are one of the reasons Japanese cinema is as famous the world over as it is. And I think Sancho the Bailiff was the height of his career.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you've said. Like, Sancho Daioh is... because I haven't seen that many of Mizoguchi's movies, but I have seen that, and I have seen Ugetsu, and Sancho is my favorite of the two of those. And it does have, I think, like what you were talking about, it has that sort of fable element, this sort of folktale structure to it, but Mizoguchi, like, really just dives into it, and, like, I mean, it feels, watching the movie to me felt like you somehow are, like, existing in that folktale, like, as it actually happened in the Heian period. Like, whether or not that specific story ever actually did happen that then turned into a folktale, it feels like, what if that story was real that we have been telling about all the time? What it would be like to actually be in there and live there and, like, live out the real time? Because that's one of the things about Sancho Daioh, that it is a movie that is about 2 hours long, as I can see here on the Wikipedia page. But that movie feels like it's a lifetime long, because you follow Zushio, the main character, through most of his life, from his, like, childhood to his sort of, like, early adulthood, and you feel that time, and you feel like you have gained the benefits of all that wisdom that he gains from that period of his life. And it's a really remarkable bit of, like, almost like kind of like didactic filmmaking, which is not something
it is
that happens all the time.
Just talking about the sheer craft of this movie, there's a 3-shot sequence that is one of the best pieces of cinematography in film history, and it's where Anju, she has decided to stay so her brother can escape, and so she, knowing that they will find her and torture her, she goes to this little lake, and in the first shot she wades into the water, and we see her go further and further down. We cut away to something just like an image, like kind of an interstitial. And when we come back, she is completely submerged, and there are little ripples coming out from where she was. And the ripples go out, and then they disappear, and the water is calm. And then we have an ellipsis. Perfection.
Yeah.
All right, so that's my number 3 film.
Okay, my number 2, sticking with Japan, my number 2 movie is Harakiri, or Seppuku.
Yeah.
Its proper title should be Seppuku, but we call it Harakiri for reasons I don't understand. But where I'm just going to refer to it as Harakiri, because that's sort of, if you get the Criterion Collection version, which I highly recommend because this is a great version of that movie, you will find it under the title of Harakiri. It is a brilliant, amazing movie by the director Masaki Kobayashi. It's my favorite one of his movies. It's later than the other Japanese movies we've been talking about, because we've been talking about...
He's kind of a
50s.
third-generation director.
Yeah.
You have Ozu and Mizoguchi are first-generation people. Kurosawa's second-gen. And then I think he's kind of that third group.
Yeah, so Harakiri is from 1962. It stars Tatsuya Nakadai.
God, he's great.
I have the biggest man crush on. He's just so amazing.
Chameleon of an actor.
Absolute chameleon of an actor, because he was like 20-something in this movie, and he plays basically for the most of the movie a 60-year-old man. It's a movie that I talked about a little bit a couple of months ago when we first kind of started getting the idea of doing this podcast for episode 200. This is one of the first movies I rewatched because I knew immediately it was going to be really high up on my list, because this movie really speaks to me. So I'm going to now read the thing I've written for it. When committing harakiri, one must be thorough. The blade is inserted in the right of the abdomen, then pulled across, slitting the belly open horizontally. Many choose to stop there. That is not harakiri. The blade is then inserted at the bottom of the chest cavity and pulled down the stomach, forming a cross with the first incision. This is harakiri. Finally, the kai shakunin, the second, delivers a swift blow to the neck. The kai shakunin must be a skilled swordsman because they must not sever the neck completely. A small sliver of skin must remain so the head swings forward into the hands of its owner and into his lap. Only then can honor be returned to the dishonored. This is what society asks of us: to commit ritual suicide, to sacrifice ourselves so that law and order can be maintained. We must destroy ourselves at the feet of those who oppress us, because it's only good manners. When I think about this, when I stare into the mask of the samurai, my blood boils. I am furious, I am outraged, I am enraged. Harakiri is that fury crystallized in film. It is a rage so pure, so vicious, that it looks at the world and with its dying breath spits blood in its face. That is the noblest form of self-destruction available to us. That is harakiri.
Masaki Kobayashi was nothing if not an angry director.
Yeah, there is this just indescribable rage at the heart of most of his movies. In particular, I think it's most articulated in Harakiri. That is unbelievable.
When I call him a third-generation director, I mean that because he was a fully post-war director.
Yeah.
And so he was not someone who, like, split the years like Ozu did. He's not someone like Kurosawa who started in the war. He came out of the war and just fucking wanted to tear society apart.
Yeah.
And there's a Criterion Eclipse box called Masaki Kobayashi Against the System. I have not dived into it fully yet, but those are some of his earlier films about like these, some of which had to be like censored for years and then finally got restored because they were just about like, you know, what did we do to ourselves?
Yeah.
You know, he was one of the first directors to fully say about the war, like, what did we fucking do to ourselves? And Harakiri is about the samurai period, but it's not entirely.
It's about, like, you can draw parallels to what this movie is about to, like, any era in history, to almost any subject matter. It does use the specific, like, mechanics and cultural, like, values and social values of the Tokugawa era in Japanese history and of, you know, of Harakiri, which was, you know, the big thing at the time among samurai, many of whom, like with Seven Samurai, had lost their jobs after the Tokugawa shogunate united Japan mainly. And so but it is, while it can be about those things specifically, and I think it's a really powerful historical movie about its era, it also so transcends its era with its themes. And I think one of the reasons why this movie is so high up on my list is because this list is being made in 2017, and I think it is a time in history to be really fucking mad about, right? And this movie is, like I said, it is like Rage Against the Machine. It is the most punk fucking movie ever made. But the best thing about it is that it's the most punk movie ever made, and 90% of the movie is like still shots of people sitting and nobody moves, and people just talk and stare at each other, and you stare at them, and it's just contained and pushed in and dense the whole fucking movie. It's just people sitting very politely on their legs and talking at each other until at the end, fucking Tsugumo, the Tatsu Nakadai character, has finally hatched his plan, and he's revealed what he is. He is basically a demon at this point who is just going to wreak his revenge against this specific clan that has wronged him, but against the whole order of samurai in Bushido and this code of honor that has twisted his life and destroyed his life and his family, and he's going to take all of that and he's going to destroy it as thoroughly as he possibly can. And watching that unfold as he meticulously reveals over the course of the movie that he is not this innocent sort of like dour old samurai who just wants to use this courtyard to commit seppuku. He is someone with a very specific plan. And it's almost like the Joker in The Dark Knight in a weird way of just he has this plan that he's going to stick to, and he is 5 steps ahead of everybody else in that courtyard, and he knows exactly what he's going to do.
Because this movie is slow with a capital S.
Yes.
It's like 2.5 hours long. As you say, it's mostly dialogue, although beautifully composed widescreen black and white photography. One of the earliest Japanese widescreen films. And it almost plays like a Japanese episode of The Twilight Zone or something.
Sure.
Because it's stories within stories and this horrific scenario that purely takes its time revealing its hand, and this steady sense of dread that builds as you realize all the little things that have brought us to this point, and the number of narrative twists and turns that will bring us to unfolding the full thematic hand of the movie. And it is a sign of the filmmaking craft and confidence that you are with them up until that hand is fully played.
Yeah, it is easily the most powerful, effective, efficient bit of plotting I have ever seen in anything. Because so often, like, the plot is not what is most remarkable about a story. Like, the plot is just what happens in how it is revealed to you. And plenty of movies have, like, perfectly fine plots. But, you know, like, the plot of Seven Samurai is very straightforward. It's an incredibly well-told story within a very simple plot. Whereas, like, Harakiri has this intricate, elaborate plot that unfolds in front of you and gives you these assumptions that then it takes away, and you get wrapped up in it, where even if you know exactly what has happened, because I've seen this movie 3 times at this point, and I know it very well because I've seen it 3 times in basically 3 years, that last time I watched it, I was so utterly absorbed in the machinations and the unfolding of everything. And I think there's something about that it is not just that it is a very well told plot, and it's a very like smartly and intricately told plot, but also the fact that it is as intricate as it is part of the thematic component of the movie, that it is this unraveling of society and of the Bushido code and of the hypocrisy that goes down like right to the like sick core of the society he lives in, and exposing that to everyone, and the utter joy he has in those moments of being able to finally just say, fuck you. Look at what I have done. Look at the fool I have made of you, because I can see society for what it is, and you cower in front of that. And it is, again, in the period of history that we live in right now, I think Harakiri is a valuable movie to see, because I think it is very cathartic to just have that expression of rage against the society you live in. But I think it's instructive about like how to be angry. It says it's okay to be angry. You fucking should be angry. It's your responsibility to be angry at this shit. And I think sometimes you need that push to not slide into acceptance of things that you should not be accepting of. And Harakiri is that motivation for me. And it is just an unbelievably powerful movie in every single regard. So that's my number 2 movie.
My number 2 movie, I get to talk about the man who I think is not just the greatest of all Japanese directors, by extension, I think the greatest director who ever walked this earth. Tied for my favorite director, personally, is the great Yasujiro Ozu, who was a very prolific Japanese director, made over 60 films, although a number of those do not survive from his silent period. He's a man who made films, silent films. He made sound black and white films, and for his last 6 films, he made sound color films. One of the very few examples of a director who spanned that many eras and kind of got better and better through each of them. And the film I think is his best, is his greatest. If I were doing the Sight and Sound poll and saying number 1 all time, what is it? It is 1949's Late Spring, or Banshun. This is one of his most famous post-war films. Most people who know Ozu know Tokyo Story, his film from 1954? No, 1?
I'd have to look it up for you.
It's okay. Early summer might be 1951. Anyway, I think it's 1953. There we go. Okay. I'm trying to think of because there's a little break after that. Anyway, but Late Spring is the first film he did with Setsuko Hara, who became sort of the main leading lady in his film. Not the main. She was only in like 6 or 7 of his movies total, but they were like 6 or 7 of his most famous movies, so she's very present. Setsuko Hara, interestingly, I'll just say this now, retired the same year Ozu died in the 1960s. And she went off to a village somewhere and was never heard from again, was a complete recluse in terms of like she went back to her real name. She stopped being an actress, and she died in 2015.
Yep, September 5th, 2015.
Which is, but we didn't know until December.
Yeah.
Because like that's how private she was. But what she does here is amazing. This film also stars Chishu Ryu, who was the leading man for many of Ozu's films. And we actually have no way to confirm this because a lot of his films are lost, but Chishu Ryu said that he was in all but 2 of Ozu's films, sometimes in very small cameos, sometimes as in this, as the male lead. So Late Spring is a very defining film for Ozu because you get Setsuko Hara, you get Chishu Ryu, you get one of the first in a line of films that is about a father and a daughter, and the father realizing that his daughter is of the age that she must go off and be married, and kind of this tension between them, and he would repeat that story structure many times. I think Late Spring is the best of those, and I think his most powerful and accomplished work. There's a lot of broad strokes out there about Ozu. People like to say he's the most Japanese of all directors. I find that equally as racist as the Kurosawa thing.
Well, I mean, there's only 2 directors. There's Kurosawa and there's Ozu. One of them has to be Western, one has to be Eastern. That's just how it works, Jonathan.
Yeah.
That's how the world is. Come on.
And there's an interesting, and they also, like, with that we say, like, oh, Ozu never moves his camera, and Ozu is only inside, and Ozu is only about families, and he only had 2 or 3 stories, and he told them over and over. Some of those things there is truth to many of those things. He was very interested in Japanese culture, his own culture. He was very engaged with these ideas. He was very interested in the Japanese household. He didn't move his camera much. It doesn't move at all in his color films, for instance. But I also think we overlook so many things. Like when we say he's the most Japanese of all directors, Yasujiro Ozu loved American movies so much that when he was on leave from the military in Europe at one point during the war, he like snuck off and saw all these American films, which he wasn't supposed to do. Because,
right.
Japanese military in the 30s, right? And there's a box set you can get from Criterion, the Eclipse thing, of 3 crime dramas that are so influenced by American crime movies. They're wonderful, but they're so influenced that one of them, they're all dressed in American gangster outfits, and they go to these clubs and do these American dances, and it's a complete fantasy world that never existed in the island nation of Japan.
Right.
And he did bring some of those influences forward. He has American movie posters in a lot of his movies. But I do think what is true about Ozu's larger body of work, especially his sound films, is that it is an ongoing tapestry. And all of his films are pieces in this tapestry. And they share plot points. They share characters. Setsuko Hara is in 3 movies where she plays a character named Noriko. This was the first one. Then there was Early Summer and Tokyo Story. You'll even hear from the titles that they all have very similar titles. There's Late Spring. There's also a film called Early Spring, which was his second to last black and white movie. There is a Early Summer and a Late Autumn. And all of these. And they all kind of, play on similar themes. Late Spring would be somewhat reworked in the 50s as Late Autumn, which is another film with Setsuko Hara. It's one of his color movies where she is now a mother and realizes her daughter needs to be married off. And it's kind of, we go through this story again a little bit, but now with Setsuko Hara as the parent. So I do think that to fully appreciate Ozu, you have to watch a lot of his movies, and you have to see how they all play together, because I do think there's a tapestry kind of nature to them. I have seen 21 Ozu movies at my last count. I am on a hunt to try to see everyone that is in existence. I've seen everything that is out in the United States. All of them are through Criterion, and I'm now starting to import from the UK to find some other ones. But, I think he is the greatest, and there's so many things I could talk about. But let's talk about Late Spring. Late Spring is very important in its post-war setting. Noriko, the character played by Setsuko Hara, is getting over an illness. It's inferred developed working hard labor during the war. There's this whole push from modernity to kind of the old traditions where, downstairs where the father lives, the father and mother or daughter live together. These are very traditional Japanese family structures. And the father always sits on the floor on the tatami mat, and he's got his little table. But upstairs, Noriko has very modern, wicker furniture from the United States or from the West or something. And when she brings her friend up there, they have little tea and cups like that and stuff. But there is this tension that they are very happy being together, the father and the daughter. The mother has died at some point. Noriko, she takes a lot of, I think, pleasure and pride in sort of being the homemaker and making sure everything's okay for her father. And she feels like this is my little corner of the world and my purpose, and I'm happy. And Shishiryu, of course, loves having his daughter around. He's a good man. He's a professor and all these things. But his emotions are fraught inside because he starts seeing these examples of what happens when family members don't move on, when the world doesn't move on. And I think this is a story about moving on. It is about the daughter realizing, in some sense, why she has to marry, the father realizing why he has to let go and not be selfish about it, and also about a society, a Japan that is going through the occupation, has been through the war, and is in itself trying to figure out what it is now. And so Ozu's films were very insular. They're inside the Japanese households. They're about traditional Japanese family structures, but they always spoke for a lot more than that. Late Spring, I think, is so powerful in so many ways. There's a scene in the middle of this movie that lasts almost 10 minutes where Noriko and her father go to see a No performance, the traditional theater style. And it's such a memorable set piece because it's slow with a capital S, as I said, because No is slow with a capital S.
Yeah.
But I love it. It is... Noriko has been confronted with the marriage idea at this point. She started to shut out her father, so there's all this tension between them in that theater at that time. This simple act of watching a play becomes so emotionally fraught, and then to watch the performers, we're watching them, we're watching the watchers of the performance. It's a wonderful, wonderful scene. Ozu is unparalleled as having these rigorous developments of interior spaces where he will have one set or a small number of sets and his camera explores them so thoroughly. Even though his camera doesn't move a lot, his compositions are so painterly and wonderful and composed, and I love them. And this is one of the best. I mean, Ozu is famous also for his little interstitial shots where he will, between scenes or in the middle of scenes, just go out and we're going to look at a sign on the road, or we're going to look at a little temple, or we're going to look at the sea kind of cascading back and forth. And I think it makes for my favorite cinematography of all time in terms of live-action photography. for instance, there's this one scene where they go to Kodai Temple in Kyoto, where it's their last trip together as father and daughter before she gets married. And there's just this little shot of a little fountain pouring a little stream of water in the foreground, and in the background, framed by the walls, there's a little group of girls walking. That's beautiful. There's another scene where that might be a different scene than what I was talking about, but there's another one where they're at the temple later in the movie, and Noriko and the father are kind of considering things, and she's looking. It's one shot, and then we cut away to an urn, and then we cut back. And it's so associative. He doesn't need to say anything, but the ideas are there. That's the sadness of this movie. The whole second half of this movie, I feel so on the verge of tears. I think it is so precisely made, so emotionally made, and this transition of these people, having to move on in their lives. And this, Ozu did not just accept these social structures that he is looking at. Like, there's a sense he is a very traditional director because he engages with tradition. But if you can watch Late Spring and think he is fully okay with the institution of marriage, there's something wrong with you and you didn't get the movie.
Yeah.
He is, I think, very fraught about these ideas. And it is a journey. Go to his first color movie, Equinox Flower, which is about a daughter refusing an arranged marriage and deciding to marry one of her friends. That is an incredible movie about kind of these changing social mores and about people coming to terms with a different kind of moving on. Where at that point, that's a 1958 film, I think, and society has moved on a lot and things are different. But this movie is so incredibly powerful to me. It is so good. The ending is so beautifully poetic, where the father, after Noriko has been married, goes home. He hangs up his coat. He sits down alone in Noriko's furniture, which he has brought downstairs almost as a memento of her. He takes an apple and starts to peel it, almost absent-mindedly out of habit. There's this shot close in on his hands, very unusual shot for Ozu as he does it, and then he just cracks. And Shishu Ryu, who is one of my favorite actors, starts to weep. We have a pause, the apple skin falls to the floor, and he just can't do it anymore. And we end with a shot of the ocean at twilight as the waves roll over each other and onto the shore. When I talk about poetic cinema, that is poetry. And that's an example of still Ozu shots. I think Late Spring has some of his best moving camera. There's a great scene where Noriko and a male friend who she maybe would like to marry until she realizes he's taken are going on this bike ride. And if you want another example of how Ozu was very slyly political as they go on this bike ride, it's a really fun, happy scene, and the camera moves with them past the bike, and then it stops as they leave the frame on a Coca-Cola sign that takes up the whole frame. It's a really famous moment, but it is incisive, and it got past the censors because it's just that subtle. Because at this point, Japan was still occupied by the Allied forces. So many things I could talk about with this movie. The last thing I want to say is that Ozu is hard to get into these days. When I first saw Tokyo Story, which is the first movie I saw my first year of film school, I bounced right off of it. It's another one I was very arrogantly dismissive of. It called to me later on, and I went back to it, and I fell in love, and that's eventually what led me to Late Spring and his other wonderful works. So I would encourage you to, pick one of his famous movies and start there and just try it and look at it. I think the other thing that alienates people is they're all about marriage and like these family structures, that's not how we do things in America today or in the world today. So how do we relate to that? And to me, it's like there's so many things to relate to in here because marriage is the vehicle through which these characters express and have to do these things because that was true to society at the time. But, to me, like Late Spring is a movie that speaks to me so powerfully because there was a period when when my father was dying of cancer, and I was kind of his primary caregiver for a lot of time, and I really didn't want to go back to college. I did not want to leave and go on with my life because I felt like he needs me. This is how I'm defining myself. I don't know how to move on beyond this. And when I saw Late Spring, it spoke to me on that level so powerfully. Even though I am not Noriko, I was not facing an arranged marriage. There are so many things you can connect with in these movies. They are the most beautifully human movies ever made. And Late Spring earns its place for that reason on my list.
Yeah. Ozu is one of that's probably my biggest sort of shame in Japanese cinema is I've only seen Tokyo Story, and I keep on meaning to. I feel like it's one of those where you just have to find the right time, right? Mm-hmm. You have to find the right moment because it's not.
And I go through moods with them where I will watch. If I watch one Ozu movie, I watch 5 or 6.
Yeah.
But then I might go months without watching one.
Yeah, it's just his style and the kinds of movies he makes. You need that. I'm just waiting for it to strike. But
I'll say I'm impressed. Filmstruck, the Criterion streaming service, has all of his movies they have on disc, and several they don't yet have on disc. So they have a huge Ozu collection. I don't know if the silent films they have scores. That might just be on the DVDs, and those are a little awkward to watch without any accompaniment. Silent films are not meant to be watched that way, despite what hipsters might tell you. But they do have 2 Eclipse sets of his silent films, and I love his silent films as well, although we're talking about one of his sound ones. Yeah. But anyway.
I also have to say, I'm looking at the Wikipedia article for Late Spring. It is just behind Mulholland Drive as the longest Wikipedia article I've ever seen for a movie. Look at this fucking thing. It is massive.
Oh, God, because a lot of his films have very short Wikipedia pages.
Yeah,
that's
I was
amazing.
clicking through a bunch of the other ones, and I think Tokyo Story is the only other one that has a pretty... And even Tokyo Stories isn't that huge.
No, and Ozu is interesting because unlike Kurosawa and Mizoguchi, whose films went west immediately, and, Rashomon won a big prize at Venice or something, like... Ozu's films were not released outside of Japan until like the 70s. And that's when they started getting critical attention. And basically because we had a couple of, American scholars like David Bordwell and Donald Ritchie who lived in Japan and spoke Japanese, who went there and did these big monographs on Ozu. And now he's, considered one of the best directors ever. But for a long time, like his movies in Japan, they did not go west for years and years. But anyway, that's my number 2.
Awesome.
And I'm pretty sure I know what your number 1 is, so I'm excited to hear it.
We'll see, because I'm going to do a fun thing here. I'm not going to say what my number 1 is yet. I'm going to read what I have written, and then by the end, it will be clear what movie I'm talking about. But people who are dedicated listeners to the podcast will probably be able to pick out what I'm going to be talking about here. So my number 1 movie. There are 2 kinds of people in this world. Cyclopses and dragons. The Cyclops stumbles myopically, never able to see the depth of the world, and the dragon flies majestically above it all, able to see the bending of the horizon. The Cyclops is jealous of the dragon's sight, and the dragon little tolerates the Cyclops' bumbling. So, whenever a Cyclops and dragon meet, they always fight. At first, the dragon is fierce with its sharp claws and roaring flames, but the Cyclops has hands and does not need depth of sight to build tools. The Cyclops builds a mighty spear to challenge the dragon, and each time the spear breaks, he builds one even mightier, until at last the spear is built powerful enough to slay the dragon. But what does a Cyclops do with a dragon-slaying spear when there are no dragons left to fight? When I look over this list of movies, there's one thing that connects them all. One theme that connects all my favorite films, TV shows, video games, and novels. The monster. Everywhere I look, I see the monster. The Cyclops, the dragon, the cyborg, the ghost, the fly, the alien, the octopus and the spider, the monolith, the train, the ape, the bandit, the samurai. My whole life, I've been chasing after the monsters. I lied to you earlier. There aren't 2 kinds of people. There's only one kind of people, and it's just people. But there is a dragon. He is mighty and ancient and fierce. He little tolerates our bumbling, and we never know what to do with our mighty spear when we stand on his corpse. The old cliche tells us that man is the true monster. And far be it from me to argue against that ancient wisdom. The world around us is evidence enough of its truth. But while we may be the true monster, there's only one king of the monsters. He is the dragon, and he sits on his throne with his crown of scales in judgment of us. He has a name. It is Godzilla. My number 1 movie is the 1954 Japanese classic, one of the granddaddies of all monster movies. It's Godzilla.
Of course it is.
Of course it is. But I had a weirdly hard time making it my number 1. Like it was not something that when I was first putting together my list was like a sure thing. I had a long time sitting there and thinking about what fucking movie is going to be my number 1 movie, because last time around I did The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, which I still stand by as probably the greatest movie ever made. It's just not my favorite movie anymore. But there was a part of me that was because I rewatched The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. That movie's still fucking amazing. It's still probably the best adventure kind of movie I've ever seen. It expresses this really pure form of adventure I absolutely adore. But when I was putting together this list, it was either The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad is number 1 again, or it's not on the list, which clearly it is not anymore. And when I went to the point where I was like, yeah, I don't think it's The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. It's what is it going to be? And I'm just well, I guess it's got to be Godzilla, because Godzilla is a movie that I have been with my whole life. And so people who have listened to this podcast for a long time, we have talked about Godzilla a lot because it's an important thing to me. But it is something that I grew up with Godzilla, not just the first movie, but a lot of his early movies. But it was like Godzilla King of the Monsters, the weird American version of it with Raymond Burr and all that. Like, that was one of the VHS tapes I had that I would watch all the time, like that and Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla, and Godzilla versus Megalon. And I would like go to my dad's office when like sometimes, you know, we didn't have a babysitter or something. It was like, well, it's summer, I have to go somewhere, so I'm just at my dad's office. I had this little tiny TV. I just had like a backpack full of VHS tapes, and I would watch Godzilla King of the Monsters. And then later when I grew up and I got into high school, I finally watched Gojira, the original 1954 Japanese version of Godzilla, which was not really particularly available over here until like 2004 with the whole 50th anniversary stuff. And so when in high school I rewatched watched Godzilla in its proper form for the first time, and it had been the first time I'd seen anything of the original movie for the longest time, because that while I grew up with it, like that was not the one I latched onto, was not the original black and white one. I latched onto Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla, which is still an amazing movie. But when I rewatched it, I was so struck by the pure humanity that is expressed in Godzilla, and the horror of it, and the horror of war and what we do to ourselves. But I was also struck by something that I was not expecting, is that that people had been lying to me and people have been lying to you about Godzilla for your entire life, because people walk around and tell you that Godzilla is a metaphor for the nuclear bomb, and that's not true.
No.
It's so not true, because the nuclear bomb fucking dropped in the diegetic history of the movie Godzilla. You can't have a metaphor for the nuclear bomb when the nuclear bomb exists in Godzilla. The nuclear bomb is the nuclear bomb of Godzilla, right? Godzilla is something so much bigger than just the nuclear bomb. Like, Godzilla is war. Godzilla is strife. Godzilla is destruction, and it's us having to deal with that, and us having to deal with the fact that destruction is us, and it's what we do to ourselves. And as we grow as a species, as our civilization evolves, as we become more powerful, the destruction we levy upon ourselves and our fellow man becomes that much more powerful. And that's what Godzilla is about. And it's not just about nuclear weapons, because it's so much more than that. But it can only come from a place when a society has experienced such an intense unforgivable trauma as dropping 2 nuclear bombs on them during the war. And it comes from that place of all the suffering that Japan had at the war. But it also comes from this recognition that Japan was not innocent, because nobody is innocent in war. And Godzilla comes from a place of that. The most heartbreaking thing about that movie is that it isn't just that like Godzilla is something that is happening to Japan. It's something that in that movie Japan has brought upon itself, and the only way to solve that problem is to create a bigger problem in the future, and we're never going to catch up to that. And that action and that plot in Godzilla is so beautifully and poetically expressed that I have now watched this movie. I mean, I have no idea how many times I've seen it if you count the old VHS tape, because that has got to be like 20-something times. That's something ridiculous. But I've watched it at least 8, 9, 10 times maybe in its Japanese form. I watch it all the time when I need to be recentered in my sort of like moral self and my moral positions on conflict and on warfare and what it is that we should strive for in humanity. And Godzilla is that movie to me. And it is that, you know, again, I said in here, the theme that connects all of these movies and does connect basically most of the media I'm interested in does kind of boil down to this idea of the monster and what the monster expresses in us and how we are reflected in the monster. And then oftentimes, like in Ghost in the Shell and The Fly, where the protagonist is the monster. And the monstrous in fiction, I think, tells us so much about who we are. It tells us what our fears are, and it tells us the things that we need to fight against and the things we need to stand up against. And Godzilla is maybe, to me, the finest monster movie ever made.
Almost certainly.
Yeah.
Godzilla's amazing. I want to talk a bit. I mentioned 1954 earlier.
Yes.
1954 Japan. If you want to talk about a golden age of cinema, 3 movies across our respective lists.
Yeah.
Seven Samurai, Sancho the Byleth, and Godzilla all came out that year, and that's just 3 of them. You
Yeah.
could go deeper. that's an amazing, amazing time for Japanese cinema. And Godzilla, I don't think, and I think actually it being part of the Criterion Collection now has helped its reputation.
Yeah.
I still don't think critically it is engaged with enough as one of the masterpieces of Japanese cinema.
Yeah.
It's not on my personal top 10. I don't have the same quite tie to it as you do. I do think like it is an essential movie in understanding the cinema of that period.
Yeah.
And I understand it can be hard to like separate from, you know, the series is very different than the movie.
Exactly,
You know?
yeah.
But, like, ignore that for a minute and just look at that one movie and tie it into the trends of that time. So many Japanese directors were dealing with this, and Ishiro Honda and this movie were actually on the forefront of dealing with a lot of these ideas of the guilt and the horror and all these issues coming from the Second World War.
Yeah.
I mean, the bomb drops on Nagasaki in 1942, 3?
I'm going to look this up now so we do not embarrass ourselves.
I'm sad I don't know this off the top of my head, but we've been dealing with a lot of dates today.
Yeah.
But okay, so the atomic bomb, we'll figure out the date, drops. And about a decade later, Godzilla is made and is dealing with these ideas. Did you find the year?
1945.
1945, sorry. 9 years later. That's even more. Okay,
Yeah.
1945 to 1954. It takes 9 scant years for them to make, for Ishiro Honda and these people to make a movie with the power and scope of a Godzilla. It's been almost 20 years since 9/11. We have made almost no good movies or art kind of about that incident. And 9/11, very horrific thing for the American psyche, has altered the course of American and human history. It's not quite the same thing as watching a fucking atomic bomb dropped on your country.
Right.
You know? And Japan is the only culture that's had to deal with that. And I think Godzilla, if you want to know why Japanese cinema to me is maybe the best in the world, Godzilla is actually one of the movies I'd point you towards because the clarity it tells its story about, as you say, it's not a metaphor, but it is engaging with that idea.
Exactly.
It's an incredible, incredible thing.
Yeah. I mean, there's still no scene in any movie I find more heartbreaking than after Godzilla attacks Tokyo and you are in the hospital where there are people with radiation burns and children crying because their parents have been killed. And it's something about, to me, like fiction, because all of the movies I have are all different forms of genre fiction. None of them are pieces of like contemporary fiction, like Ozu movies are contemporary fiction made about their contemporary time period with contemporary characters. And there's obviously nothing wrong with those movies. There's billions of movies like that I love.
And I don't think I have any genre fiction.
Yeah.
Kind of, maybe, but we'll see.
But for me, there's like genre fiction has just always spoken to me very deeply. And I think there's something about being able to manifest the horrors of war in something concrete and physical like Godzilla means that you have to face up to it. You can't hide behind the metaphor. You can't hide behind the symbolism. You can't hide behind like the little corners, and you can't hide in your like cowardly human way of distancing yourself in some sort of empathetic manner to the people on the screen, which is what most people do when they watch movies. They don't care about that kind of stuff. And I think Godzilla forces you to immediately confront, embodied in this horrific visage of this monster, what we are and what we do, and there's no way to run away from that, and that's what the monster is. And so while there are plenty of like war movies that have a scene like the scene after Godzilla attacks Tokyo and you are in this hospital, there's something weird about if it is just representing normal actual warfare, you can kind of weirdly excuse it because it's something that happens all the time, because it's something that actually happens in the world. When it is something fantastical like Godzilla that wreaks it, I feel like you have to confront the pain and suffering that is in front of you in those scenes, and it makes it all the more horrifying to me because it is rendered to you through a lens of fantasy.
Absolutely. And one of the great special effects spectacles of all time.
Exactly, yeah.
All right, so that's your number one.
Yep.
So now it's time for my number one. You said you had a lot of trouble kind of figuring out exactly where you're going to go with that, right?
Yeah.
I did until I sat with myself for a moment and thought about it, and it was like, Jonathan, there's only one. There's only ever been one. At some points in your life, you've been too stupid to realize it, but it's always been there. It's been there with you. It's been there for you. This is your number one, and it is Hayao Miyazaki's 2001 masterpiece, Spirited Away.
Okay.
or in Japanese,
Yeah.
Sen to Chihiro no Kamikakushi,
Kamikakushi.
which means the spiriting away, roughly, of Sen and Chihiro. Kamikakushi is not an easy word to translate. It's actually if you look into the history and meaning of that word, you realize Miyazaki is playing with something pretty culturally deep there. So let me tell you my story with Spirited Away.
Okay.
Y'all know I love Miyazaki.
Yes.
I don't need to rehash all that. The first Miyazaki movie I saw would actually have been Kiki's Delivery Service on VHS way back then. God, I saw that when I was living in my grandparents' house in Arvada, so I didn't even know it was a Japanese movie, back then.
Right,
It's like,
yes.
it had Disney on the tape. Like, who knows what this
and
is?
Kiki's looks like a Disney movie, because that is one of the early ones I saw as well.
Yeah. But Spirited Away was probably the second. I saw it so it's a 2001 movie, came to the U.S. in 2002, thanks to John Lasseter and the fine folks at Pixar and Disney. And in 2002, I saw it at an early press screening. It was maybe the first press screening I ever went to for the Colorado Kids when I was writing for that little youth-oriented paper with the Denver Post. I was 10 years old when this came out. And when I first saw Spirited Away, I bounced right off it, as I've said of a couple movies on this list, or directors on this list. I thought it was weird. I thought, oh man, why is the story going so many directions? Why is there not a villain for her to defeat? What is this weird-ass movie? And I was kind of dismissive of it. And I do have the movie Howl's Moving Castle from a few years later to thank, because I saw that at a press screening as well. Wasn't sure what to think about it before I saw it because I had not liked Spirited Away, and Howl's Moving Castle blew the back of my mind out of my head, and I fucking love that movie, and there's a poster of it hanging above my bed. I love Howl's Moving Castle. But it made me go back and look at other Miyazaki movies. And what started there was from that point on, lifelong relationship with Spirited Away. I have seen this movie more than any other film on this list, probably more than any other Miyazaki movie. Maybe that and Howl's and Princess Mononoke would all be in contention, but I've probably seen Spirited Away the most times. And whatever happens in my life, however I grow and change as a person, I keep coming back to Spirited Away. And when I was a kid, it took me a couple of times to get this movie and realize, Jonathan, you're fascinated with it. You've watched it 4 times. You don't dislike this movie. You love this fucking movie, and you're too dense about it to realize it. And that's okay because, Spirited Away is a movie for all audiences in Japan. It is so culturally Japanese. I totally understand why a 10-year-old kid in America with no background in that wouldn't get it.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah.
And Spirited Away, I actually do think, is one of the least accessible Miyazaki movies for Western audiences. Even though it won the Oscar, it's got more visibility here. When you'd watch a lot of or look at a lot of people talking about their favorite Miyazaki movies over here, I actually think Spirited Away comes up less than you might think. Because there are other movies he makes that are more Western in their kind of aesthetics and whatnot. Spirited Away is about a little girl and a spirit world that opens up to her when her parents take her into this weird amusement park land, and they engage in an act of gluttony and are turned into pigs. And then she goes into the bathhouse. Arubaya is its name. And she enters this fantastic world. And there are many things I could talk about academically with Spirited Away. I think it is a fascinating story about gender and economics, in that I think it is a very Marxist film in how it builds its story. It is about this bathhouse that is supposed to be this perfect socialist society that has kind of rotted and needs the innocence of a young girl to come in and see it anew, to purge the bathhouse of this rot and try to bring it back to a very socialist kind of construct. And you see this with the Yubaba character, who is, I don't think she's a villain. I don't even know if I would call her the antagonist, but she is a force against Chihiro in the movie, and she has this thing she is bogged down by, which is this law that she has to give everyone a job and find everyone a place. And so she is this Marxist figure who has grown weary of Marxism,
Sure.
And it's this thing so again, there's all these directions you can go with academically, but for me, it is a movie I have come back to so many times in my life, and I have gone up and down with it. And there were periods where I got annoyed by the Disney dub, and now I think it's the finest of the Disney dubs. It's an incredible one. And periods where I would watch it in both English and Japanese and still feel like I respected it but was kind of cold towards it, almost like I've talked about 2001 sometimes. And now there's a period where I wholeheartedly embrace. I have no qualms calling this my favorite movie. And it is my favorite movie for so many reasons. At some points in my life, when I was younger, high school, early college, I found this film immensely sad. I thought it was one of the saddest movies out there because the arc of this movie is this horrendously hard thing Chihiro has to go through, ripped away from her parents and her safety net and all this stuff, and basically growing up over the course of this film and finding the strength within herself to find a place where she works and friends that she belongs with and people she loves, and basically becoming a full human being. And there's so much pain in that, and there's so much dark wonder in that process that Miyazaki realizes here, things that can only be expressed through the medium of animation. And then at the end of the movie, and there's one thing the dub gets wrong because it adds a line of dialogue that contradicts this. She doesn't remember it at the end of the movie. She leaves and she does not remember what has happened to her, even though we know it happened because she has the hair tie that Zenny Baba gave her. And I found that very sad because the idea is all these things she went through in the spirit world, she has to now go actualize in the real world. And all that pain and hardness, that's life that she's going to have to live with. And I found that sad. And as an adult, I look at this movie and I find it so inspiring because it is about, look at that strength that exists within this little girl. And I think Chihiro is a fascinating character design from Miyazaki because it's actually one of his most different. All of his female protagonists in the early movies are the same character design other than Nausicaa. Like the girl in Castle in the Sky, Laputa, that is Kiki, just without the bow. It's hilarious when you look at that. Chihiro's actually very different, in part because she's got a very Japanese face, but also a very kind of blank face in how he draws her early on. And she isn't a character yet at the beginning of the movie because little kids aren't characters yet, They're kind of still blank. Yeah. And there's that tabula rasa thing. And the movie's about her becoming a person. And you see the wonderful, strong, amazing person she becomes where she single-handedly, purges the bathhouse of this embodiment of greed that comes from it. There's the whole arc with the no-face character in the movie, Kaonashi. And I love that whole segment because Kaonishi is not a villain or an antagonist. He just is a mirror held up to all these really greedy people who have forgotten their actual way forward in life.
Yeah.
And getting him out of the bathhouse is this hugely symbolic act. And at the nexus of these things, the sadness and the inspiration, is my favorite sequence, hands down, in a movie ever. Driven by the great Joe Hisaishi and his music. He appears for the second time on this list. And driven by some of the best animation you will ever see, showing that Hayao Miyazaki is the greatest of all time at this. And that is the 6th station scene, which is where she gets on the train and she goes to find Zenny Baba. And the train throughout the movie is this thing of sublimity to me. And the sublime, remember, that's not to say the word sublime is not to say that looks really beautiful or something.
Right.
The sublime, like as described by Edmund Burke, has like a very specific definition, which is something that is so beautiful it is horrifying, or so horrifying it is beautiful. Something that is so grand and beyond the scope of human understanding that it strikes something within you so deep. And Hayao Miyazaki, I think, is uniquely gifted at expressing sublimity in his movies, partially because of the animated medium. But the 6th station is where I get that sense of sublimity, because you're walking down the tracks in that eerie, otherworldly water to a little station in the ocean, and there's these beautiful white clouds bisecting the sky. And the ocean extends forever. It is an eternal ocean. It goes to all places. It's like she is at a nexus of dimensions. And then this train comes through, and it's full of all these black, shadowy figures. Not that they're bad figures or anything, they're just unknowable, and therefore kind of intimidating. The train that moves through this world, or is it just of this world? Is it connected to all worlds? We see shadows of businessmen, of mothers, of old crones, of a little girl on the train tracks. All sorts of shadows all together on this train, moving ever forward. There's no return journey. The train only goes one way. That train is life. That's why it's so sad and scary, but also exhilarating too. So many beautiful shots here. There's the iconic shots, of No Face sitting down right next to Chihiro that we've all seen. And going past all those places that are alone in this infinite ocean, just like these little stops. At that one stop, there's this little girl who looks at Chihiro from the tracks. Again, she's just a shadow. And you think, that's another person, another little girl growing up on their own journey, waiting. From Chihiro's perspective, we see her, they kind of almost lock eyes. It's haunting. Eventually the train empties out, but it just keeps going and going past neon signs and signs of, capitalism and consumerism, maybe from our world or other worlds. And then the best shot of the whole film, which is Chihiro looking forward, determined, slow zoom in on her face, and she's reflected. One half of her face, one half in the mirror or in the window, both stoic and determined as we go into the night, but not deterred. And the way that scene transitions from day into night is one of the most beautiful things about it. The sunset, the sense of eternity. To me, that scene is everything for the movie, for Miyazaki's career, for animation, for film, for life. It is a masterpiece within a masterpiece. And, I could talk for hours about Spirited Away. I'm actually giving a little guest lecture at the University of Colorado this fall about the movie. But that is the scene that if I have to talk about why it's my favorite movie, I'll just talk about that. This is as deep and great and beautiful a movie I think has ever been made. And you can return to it 100 times and see 100 different things. I have seen it, so many times and always see new things in it. And I had not even really thought when I started making the list, it's kind of my number one movie is an animated movie. To me, movies are just movies.
Yeah.
And this is as good as movies get. It's my favorite. It's my number one.
Yeah. No, Spirited Away is fantastic. I really need to, because I have not seen it since I learned Japanese. I need to see it in that different light.
Yeah.
Because that is definitely, it's a very different experience when you can see a movie like that. And I haven't seen Spirited Away probably since high school.
Yeah. It's on Blu-ray now. I have all the Ghibli Blu-rays from Japan, which are wonderful and I love them, but, maybe not all American audiences want to go to those crazy collector's lengths.
Right.
But I should say Disney has released some of them on Blu-ray, and their Blu-rays are really scattershot because, sometimes I don't own them, but I know, they've left off subtitle tracks and things like that, which you need those.
Yes.
But really good news. The studio G Kids, which has been releasing the most recent Ghibli movies and has even brought some that were never released here, like Ocean Waves and Only Yesterday, the latter being my favorite of the Takahata films. They've finally gotten those out here. Disney has given up the license to Ghibli. G Kids now owns all of them, and they are reissuing every single Ghibli film on Blu-ray here. They're partnering with Universal. They're going to have all of them out. They're going to mirror the Japanese Blu-rays as much as they can, so all the same bonus features and stuff. There'll be Blu-ray DVD combo packs. Those are starting in October, and I highly recommend supporting those because if you want these movies, those will be the best versions in the States to have. Because I know they're going to do it. They've even said, we're finally getting a subtitle track on Mononoke and, on these ones. Because, Disney released a Princess Mononoke release without fucking subtitles.
Yeah.
Because that's how much they cared about these movies. Anyway, but Spirited Away, that's my number one. There we go.
Yeah.
You want to do the good old-fashioned countdown, Sean?
Let's do the countdown.
And recap these?
Yeah.
All right. So, let's see. My number 10 was Mulholland Drive.
My number 10 is Ghost in the Shell.
My number 9 was The Double Life of Veronique.
My number 9 is The Fly.
My number 8 is the Apu Trilogy.
My number 8 is Alien.
My number 7 is The Tree of Life.
My number 7 is Spider-Man 2.
My number 6 is City Lights.
My number 6 is 2001: A Space Odyssey.
And my number 5 is Hanabi.
My number 5 is Once Upon a Time in the West.
My number 4 is Seven Samurai.
My number 4 is King Kong.
My number 3 is Sancho the Bailiff.
My number 3 is Seven Samurai.
My number 2 is Late Spring.
My number 2 is Harakiri.
My number 1 is Spirited Away.
And my number 1 is Gojira.
Nice. You have any honorable mentions you want to list?
Kind of like the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. That's one. I feel like we kind of have talked about most of my honorable mentions. Like Mulholland Drive is one that... Mulholland Drive and Fire Walk With Me are both movies that I think in a couple of years are in strong contention to maybe be on this list.
So I have a list of 10 alphabetized. I'll go through really quick.
Okay.
Battle Royale from 2000 we mentioned. Right. Blade Runner, Ridley Scott. Blazing Saddles by Mel Brooks.
Sure, yeah.
Fuck yeah. Do the Right Thing by Spike Lee.
Yeah.
No more relevant movie for today.
That's definitely true.
Only Yesterday, which I just mentioned by Isao Takahata, finally out on Blu-ray in the United States, and it had never even been out on DVD. So go get that; it's beautiful. Raiders of the Lost Ark by Steven Spielberg. A movie you might not have heard of called Spring, Summer, Fall, Winter, and Spring by Kim Ki-duk, South Korean movie. Utterly wonderful, and the best movie about religion ever made. The Darjeeling Limited from 2007, my favorite of Wes Anderson's movies. The Godfather, obviously, and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It has not left my heart, just my top 10.
Yeah, and like all of my old top 10 list is also in the honorable mentions because I still stand by those. I also want to have one other honorable mention. This is something I very briefly considered before. I was like, this is absurd. There's no way I could justify doing this. There was a time when I was like, I'm just going to have all 26 Zatoichi movies. This is like my number 10 slot.
Well, okay, here's how you could justify that.
Okay.
Criterion, when they put out a box set, they usually give every film in the box set its own spine number.
Okay.
For Zatoichi, that would have been 26 spines, and apparently they didn't want to do it, so that box has just one spine number for 26 films. So, You could justify it.
Okay, I could justify it using that logic. I couldn't justify it to myself because but I also, there's like no one Zatoichi movie that on its own would stand up against some of these other ones. But I still stand by Zatoichi that if you are a fan of samurai movies, which we clearly both are, that is a series that is just utterly amazing. And the character of Ichi that is at the heart of that series, played by the wonderful Shintaro Katsu.
And then
that's just, people should watch those movies.
And then if you want to revisit a director from my list, Takeshi Kitano did make a Zatoichi movie that is wonderfully bizarre.
Yes, it's a very strange. It is in some ways like the most Zatoichi movie of the Zatoichi movies, and in some ways it's not like any of the other Zatoichi movies at all.
Which is probably what you would want out of it.
It is exactly what I want out of it.
Yes. I want to go through some stats from my list really quick.
Okay.
I thought were fun. 7 of my 10 films are in the Criterion collection. So if you want to know why I love Criterion, that's why.
There you go.
And at least one more, The Tree of Life, will almost certainly be in it one day because they've got Malik's first 4, and that would be the next one on their list. 7 of those 10 were also foreign films. 5 from Japan, a full half of my list. 1 from France/Poland, 1 the trilogy from India. And then 3 American, although only 2 of them have dialogue in them because 1's silent.
Yeah.
So I just thought those were for some fun stats. I also have, most of mine were from before the turn of the century. So I only have, I think, 3 from the 2000s.
Yeah, for me, I have 4 Japanese movies. So Ghost in the Shell, and then my top 3 movies are all Japanese. My top 4 movies are all black and white. The other ones are all in color. And then all my non-Japanese movies are all American except for Once Upon a Time in the West is Italian.
Nice.
Yeah.
And actually, I had half black and white and half color. And I did kind of work at that a little bit because when I realized I should have the Apu trilogy on there, I had 6 color and 4 black and white, and it felt wrong to me. So I was able to bump one off and get more black and white.
Yeah.
Black and white is fucking great.
Yes.
God damn it.
Yes, my top 4 movies are black and white, so I definitely agree with you. And for me, I think the only movie that was in past 2000 was Spider-Man 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. All right. Well, Sean, we have done 200 of these fucking things.
God, yes, we have.
Anything? I don't know. Any podcast recollections to share? Or I'm kind of beat, but
we've talked a lot about a lot of random bullshit on this fucking podcast, haven't we, Jonathan?
We have talked about so many things. Thank you to everyone who has listened for 5 episodes, 10 episodes, 200 episodes. I know there's some
more. You could technically have done more.
Yes, I did. I tweeted about this a little bit. I don't count the monthly 10 and monthly stuff. Those were, you might not even know about those. We did do some other podcasts before. You weren't even on all of them, so I don't count them. They were kind of test runs.
Yes, so it's like a proto-podcast.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sort of like The Simpsons doesn't count the Tracy Ullman shorts.
Sure.
When it gets to 700 episodes or whatever it's at now. So anyway, but yeah, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for listening in the future. I've had so much fun doing this show over the years, Sean.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to do more. And we're going to have more. So patreon.com/Weekly Stuff Podcast.
Yes.
We have some cool rewards. We're excited to start doing those. I do think if you sign up on the Let's Play Early Access level, the Warthog level, I'm thinking Fridays when I'll put out that first batch of Halo Let's Plays.
Awesome.
That could change, but I think that'll be a fun day to get them out for the Early Access people because I can definitely have them ready by then. And we can start having some thoughts on those. And then the first Doctor Who one will be somewhere in the middle of this month. I'm thinking on or around the 15th of every month is what we're going to shoot for. So, yeah, I'm really excited going forward what we're going to do with this.
Yes, it's a big moment for the history of this podcast. And there's a lot of awesome projects going forward. I'm really excited to do this classic Doctor Who stuff. I'm very excited to rewatch The Aztecs because I haven't seen that one in a very long time, which is kind of half the reason why I picked it is because I just wanted to rewatch it. But then also, I'm excited to hear people's feedback on our Let's Play stuff because I think, we recorded all of these first batch of episodes in kind of one big sitting. And so I'm interested to see what people's input is, like constructive criticism, because I think they turned out really great. I'm excited to do more of them. All right, so we've done 200. Maybe we'll do 200 more. I don't want to think about it, though. Yes, but I mean, the best way to get ahead of these things, I know I said this last time, but we really probably should start thinking about what we're going to do for episode 300. It's going to sneak up on us, man.